Consider the moment when you decide to change yourself, to become a different person than you currently are, and notice the peculiar logical trap that ensnares this intention from its very inception. The person who makes the decision to change is, by definition, the same person who will carry out that change, and yet we somehow believe that this unchanged person possesses the capacity and the will to transform themselves into someone fundamentally different. When you resolve to become more disciplined, you are relying upon the current version of yourself, with all of its existing weaknesses and tendencies toward procrastination, to somehow generate the motivation and consistency necessary to override those very same weaknesses. The mechanism at work here involves a curious split in our perception of identity, where we treat our present self and our future self as distinct entities despite them being fundamentally continuous across time. We convince ourselves that tomorrow we will be different, stronger, more committed, even though the person who will wake tomorrow is shaped by the exact same neurological patterns, habits, and character traits that exist today. This psychological division allows us to maintain hope and agency in the face of our own consistency, creating an imaginary distance between who we are and who we might become. Yet this paradox persists not because we have failed to notice it, but rather because we have learned to normalize it as a feature of human existence rather than a logical impossibility. We have constructed entire industries, philosophies, and self-help frameworks around this contradiction, accepting that change is simultaneously inevitable and nearly impossible, that we can transform ourselves while remaining fundamentally unchanged. The paradox endures because without it, we would have to accept either complete determinism or complete free will, and accepting change at all requires us to believe in this strange middle ground where we are both the unchanging force and the changing canvas simultaneously. Consider the curious predicament of the person who pursues pleasure above all else, who has arranged their entire existence around the singular goal of experiencing joy and satisfaction and the avoidance of all discomfort, only to discover that this very pursuit somehow eludes them at every turn, slipping through their fingers like sand the moment they believe they have grasped it firmly. The hedonist awakens each morning with a clear intention to maximize their happiness through whatever means available, whether through indulgence in food or entertainment or leisure activities, yet finds that the more desperately they chase these sensations, the more hollow and fleeting they become, until what once promised transcendent pleasure transforms into merely another routine obligation. The mechanism underlying this paradox operates through a psychological principle known as hedonic adaptation, wherein the human nervous system becomes acclimated to positive experiences with remarkable speed, requiring ever-increasing doses of stimulation to produce the same emotional response that once came easily and naturally. When pleasure is pursued as the primary objective rather than as a byproduct of meaningful engagement, the mind begins to measure success by the intensity of sensation rather than by depth of satisfaction, creating an exhausting treadmill where satisfaction perpetually recedes into the future. What makes this paradox particularly persistent is that it contradicts our most fundamental understanding of motivation and reward, yet we have normalized it throughout modern consumer culture, building entire industries and economic systems around the promise that happiness can be purchased and accumulated like any other commodity. We accept without question the notion that more entertainment, more luxury, more sensory stimulation will finally deliver the contentment we seek, even as generations before us discovered through their own exhausting pursuits that this formula fundamentally fails to account for how human consciousness actually processes meaning and well-being. Consider the curious mathematics of democratic participation, where millions of citizens invest time and effort into casting a single vote, despite the statistical impossibility that their individual ballot will ever determine an election outcome. In any election of significant scale, whether local or national, the probability that one person's vote becomes the decisive factor approaches zero so completely that it exists only in the theoretical realm. Yet billions of people across the globe continue to wake early, travel to polling stations, and exercise this right with the conviction that their participation matters. The rational actor model, which forms the foundation of economic and political theory, suggests that individuals should only engage in activities when the expected benefits exceed the expected costs. And yet voting, when subjected to this calculation, reveals itself as an almost laughably irrational investment of time and effort. A typical voter might spend 2 hours traveling to and from a polling location, waiting in line, and marking their ballot and the benefit of their participation, measured purely through the mathematical probability of changing an outcome, registers at such infinitesimal levels that it borders on non-existent. Psychology and sociology explain this paradox through appeals to civic duty, social identity, habitual behavior patterns, and the satisfaction of symbolic participation, suggesting that we have constructed elaborate emotional and cultural justifications for an action that our rational minds cannot justify. Yet what remains perpetually strange is not that people vote despite the logical contradiction, but rather that society has so thoroughly normalized this irrational behavior that questioning the decision to vote is treated as heretical in many circles. We have collectively agreed to ignore the mathematics, to suppress the rational calculations that should theoretically discourage participation, and to elevate voting into a moral and cultural imperative that transcends any individual calculation of personal benefit. Consider the moment when you find yourself weeping at a film, your heart racing as a character you know does not exist faces an imaginary danger that will never truly occur, and yet your body responds with genuine physiological distress that is indistinguishable from real grief or fear. You might be sitting safely on your couch, surrounded by the comfort of your own home, fully aware that everything unfolding before you is constructed dialogue, choreographed movement, and artistic fabrication. And yet tears stream down your face while your breathing becomes shallow and your chest tightens with authentic emotional response. The paradox deepens when we recognize that you could pause the film at any moment and return to your ordinary life, that no actual person has suffered, that no genuine tragedy has occurred, and still, the emotion persists undiminished by this knowledge. This is the paradox of fiction emotion, wherein your mind simultaneously holds two completely contradictory pieces of information without experiencing cognitive dissonance. The mechanism at work appears to operate through a kind of intentional suspension of disbelief, where your brain compartmentalizes rational knowledge into one section while allowing your emotional centers to respond as though the fictional scenario were absolutely real and immediate. Your mirror neurons fire in response to the actor's simulated suffering, your amygdala processes the manufactured tension, your endocrine system releases cortisol and adrenaline as if facing actual threat, and this cascade of biological responses creates authentic emotion from entirely false premises. The paradox persists because your evolutionary emotional systems operate on pattern recognition rather than truth verification, responding to perceived suffering or danger regardless of its ontological status. We have normalized this strange duality so thoroughly that it no longer strikes most of us as remarkable that we can grieve for fictional characters with genuine tears while simultaneously understanding that grief serves no protective or adaptive function for any real person. Imagine a wheel within a wheel, two concentric circles perfectly attached to one another so that they cannot separate, rotating together as a single unit through space. The larger wheel has a circumference of 10 feet, while the smaller wheel nested inside it has a circumference of only 5 feet. When you roll this composite wheel across the ground for exactly one complete rotation, the larger wheel travels its full 10 feet, covering the distance of its entire circumference with each turn. Yet simultaneously, the smaller wheel completes that same single rotation and should therefore travel only 5 feet according to all conventional mathematics and geometry. However, because the smaller wheel is physically attached to the larger one and cannot slip or separate from it, it too must travel the full 10 feet across the ground in that same rotation, covering a distance greater than its own circumference should mathematically allow. This creates an impossible gap, a void between what the wheel is and what it does, between its intrinsic measurement and its actual movement through space. The human mind struggles to reconcile this observation because we have been trained to believe that distance traveled must correlate directly with the arc length of the object doing the traveling, yet here we witness both wheels completing their rotations simultaneously while covering different distances than their geometry prescribes. What makes this paradox persist in our consciousness is our tendency to compartmentalize physical properties and movements, treating the circumference as an independent variable rather than understanding that attachment and constraint force physical laws into uncomfortable compromises. We have somehow normalized the contradiction by simply accepting that wheels behave this way and moving forward without demanding true resolution, allowing the impossible mathematics to hide beneath layers of practical assumption and everyday observation. Imagine a society where every individual household decides to save more money and spend less on consumer goods, motivated by the perfectly rational desire to build personal wealth and security for their families. On the surface, this seems like an unambiguous good, a moral virtue celebrated across cultures and generations. Each person tightens their budget, reduces unnecessary purchases, delays large expenditures, and deposits their earnings into savings accounts with the intention of building a financial cushion against uncertainty. Yet as this behavior spreads across an entire economy, something paradoxical and counterintuitive begins to unfold. When everyone simultaneously reduces their spending, the total demand for goods and services in the economy contracts dramatically. Businesses that once relied on steady consumer spending suddenly face declining revenues and must lay off workers to maintain profitability. Those newly unemployed workers can no longer afford their own purchases, which further reduces demand, creating a cascading effect of business closures and economic contraction. Very active individuals saving more money collectively results in reduced economic growth, lower wages, fewer jobs, and ultimately less total wealth in society, meaning that those who save dutifully often find themselves worse off financially than they would have been had everyone continued spending normally. The psychological mechanism underlying this paradox stems from a fundamental confusion between what is rational for an individual and what is rational for the collective system as a whole. The individual perspective is straightforward and intuitive. Spending less and saving more increases your personal financial security. However, the systemic perspective reveals that an economy fundamentally depends on continuous circulation of money through consumption and investment, and when that circulation slows, the entire mechanism grinds toward recession. Consider the peculiar experience of holding a belief while simultaneously asserting that you do not hold that belief, a phenomenon first articulated by the philosopher G. E. Moore in the early 20th century, and it presents itself in countless moments throughout our ordinary lives in ways we rarely notice or interrogate. You might find yourself saying aloud to a friend, "I believe that I should exercise more regularly, but I don't actually believe I will," or perhaps, "I'm convinced that climate change is happening, yet I don't really believe it will affect my life significantly." And in these utterances lies a logical contradiction that should make no sense whatsoever, and yet it feels entirely natural and coherent to the person expressing it. The paradox emerges from the strange relationship between our intellectual assent to propositions and our genuine, felt conviction about those same propositions, where we can acknowledge that something is true while remaining somehow unconvinced of its truth in any meaningful sense. The psychological mechanism underlying this apparent contradiction stems from the distinction between propositional knowledge and existential belief, between what we understand to be factually correct and what we have actually internalized into our operational worldview. When you assert that you believe something is true while simultaneously denying that you believe it, you are not actually committing a strict logical fallacy in the formal sense, but rather you are revealing the gap between abstract intellectual agreement and the deeper, more embodied conviction that actually guides your behavior and emotional responses. This paradox persists in human thought and speech because our minds naturally operate on multiple levels of belief simultaneously, where we can hold competing certainties that seem to coexist in different registers of consciousness. Consider the ancient philosopher Epicurus and his attempt to reconcile the existence of suffering with the concept of an all-powerful, benevolent deity, a logical puzzle that has haunted theological thought for millennia and continues to perplex believers and skeptics alike in our modern era. The paradox emerges from a deceptively simple question. If a supreme being possesses the power to eliminate all suffering and also possesses the desire to do so, then why does suffering persist in the world? If this entity is truly omnipotent, it must have the capability to prevent all pain and misery, and if it is truly benevolent, it must desire to do so, yet we observe suffering everywhere around us, from the moment we are born until the moment we die. The mechanism underlying this paradox operates through the collision of three seemingly irreconcilable concepts: absolute power, perfect goodness, and the undeniable existence of evil and pain in reality. When we attempt to hold all three of these ideas simultaneously in our minds, they create an internal logical contradiction that cannot be smoothed away through simple reasoning. Yet generations of theologians, philosophers, and ordinary people have developed elaborate explanations and rationalizations to maintain their belief systems despite this fundamental contradiction. We have normalized this paradox by invoking concepts such as free will, divine mystery, spiritual growth through suffering, or the notion that evil serves some greater cosmic purpose we cannot comprehend. And through these explanations, we have managed to live comfortably with a logical impossibility at the heart of our most cherished beliefs. The paradox persists not because it has been solved, but because humans possess a remarkable capacity to hold contradictory beliefs when those beliefs are deeply woven into our cultural fabric, our emotional identity, and our search for meaning in an uncertain universe. Consider the peculiar nature of human satisfaction, where a person spends years working toward a specific goal, imagining that achieving it will fundamentally transform their existence and grant them lasting contentment. Yet upon reaching that milestone, the joy fades within weeks or months, returning them to their baseline emotional state as though nothing significant had occurred at all. This individual might have sacrificed relationships, health, and present moments in pursuit of a promotion, a salary increase, a new home, or a romantic partnership, only to discover that the happiness derived from the achievement is remarkably short-lived, that their brain adapts to the new circumstance with bewildering speed, and that they soon find themselves yearning for the next goal, the next acquisition, the next promised source of fulfillment. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon, known as hedonic adaptation, functions as an invisible treadmill upon which humans continually run without ever truly progressing toward a destination of permanent satisfaction. Our nervous systems evolved to detect changes in our environment and circumstances, to register improvement or decline, but not to remain perpetually attuned to a new normal, because such constant vigilance would diminish our capacity to notice genuine threats or opportunities. This adaptive quality served our ancestors well in the wilderness, where becoming complacent about a slightly better shelter or consistent food supply could mean death. But in modern life, it creates a paradox where achievement itself becomes meaningless, where the pursuit becomes the only constant, and where fulfillment remains perpetually out of reach, no matter how many goals are accomplished. Imagine yourself standing in a grocery store aisle facing a wall of cereal boxes, each one promising something slightly different from the last, and you find yourself unable to move forward, unable to make a selection, even though you are genuinely hungry and genuinely need to choose something to eat right now. The paradox deepens when you consider that having more options should logically make you happier and more satisfied, yet the abundance of choices paralyses you into complete inaction, and sometimes you abandon the aisle entirely without purchasing anything at all. This phenomenon extends far beyond breakfast foods into every corner of modern life, from selecting a streaming service and scrolling endlessly through available content without watching anything, to standing before a restaurant menu so extensive that you cannot decide what to order within a reasonable time frame, to facing a dating application with thousands of potential matches and never initiating a single conversation, because the sheer volume of possibilities makes every individual choice feel simultaneously trivial and overwhelming. The psychological mechanism underlying this paradox operates through several interconnected channels. As options multiply, the cognitive load required to evaluate each possibility increases exponentially rather than linearly, and the opportunity cost of choosing one thing becomes glaringly apparent because you can see all the other things you are simultaneously rejecting. Additionally, the presence of numerous options creates an amplified sense of responsibility for making the perfect choice, transforming what should be a simple decision into a high-stakes evaluation where any selection feels potentially wrong. The paradox persists despite being entirely illogical because we have constructed an economic and social landscape that relentlessly celebrates choice as the supreme good, treating unlimited options as an unqualified blessing. Yet we have simultaneously failed to acknowledge that human cognitive capacity has finite limits and that constraint can actually be liberating rather than limiting. Imagine standing at the base of a monumental staircase constructed with perfect geometric precision, where each step rises clearly above the one before it, where the architecture appears mathematically sound and structurally absolute. Yet as you climb higher and higher with unwavering determination, you find yourself returning to the exact point where you began, having never descended a single step, having never reversed your direction. having only moved forward in what seemed like an endless upward trajectory that somehow completed itself in a closed loop. The Penrose stairs represent one of architecture's most elegant impossibilities, a structure designed by mathematician Roger Penrose in 1958 that uses perspective tricks and impossible geometry to create a staircase that appears to ascend continuously while simultaneously returning to its starting position without any logical mechanism for doing so. In the real world, such a structure cannot exist in three-dimensional space, yet the moment we view it rendered in 2 dimensions on a page or screen, our minds accept the paradox as perfectly reasonable, processing each individual step as legitimate while refusing to acknowledge that the cumulative pathway violates every principle of spatial geometry and gravitational physics that we understand. The psychological mechanism at work here involves our brain's tendency to process visual information in sequential stages rather than holistically, examining each corner and staircase segment independently before attempting to synthesize them into a complete picture. And by the time we reach the final step in our visual journey, we have somehow forgotten where we began, making the impossible loop feel not just plausible, but inevitable. We encounter these stairs not in our actual architecture, but in our artwork, our illustrations, our digital renderings, and perhaps most disturbingly, in our daily lives when we find ourselves repeating the same routines, making the same choices, and arriving at the same conclusions despite our conviction that we are moving forward toward progress and change. Imagine standing at the edge of a coastline on a perfectly clear day, looking down at the precise boundary where land meets water, and you begin to measure its length with increasing precision, starting first with a ruler held at arm's length, then with a smaller ruler, then with a measuring tape, then with a string, then with increasingly refined instruments, only to discover that with each attempt at greater accuracy, the coastline becomes measurably longer, never converging on a final true length. Stretching infinitely longer the more carefully you observe it. This is the coastline paradox, a genuine phenomenon that emerged from mathematical observation rather than from theoretical speculation, where the complexity of nature reveals itself not as an approximation, but as a fundamental fractal structure that refuses to settle into a simple number. The mechanism behind this strange persistence of growth lies in the self-similar nature of natural borders, where the jagged edges of a coastline contain smaller jagged edges within them, and those edges contain even smaller patterns of identical complexity, creating an infinite recursion of detail that no measurement can fully capture or resolve. What makes this paradox particularly unsettling is that we have accepted it into our ordinary understanding of geography and mathematics without much resistance, naming it calmly as the Richardson effect, publishing it in textbooks, and yet we continue to draw coastlines on maps as if they possess definable lengths, treating them simultaneously as both infinitely complex and practically measurable for the purposes of navigation and law. The paradox persists not because we do not understand it, but because we have simply chosen to live with the contradiction, accepting that reality operates at a scale of infinite detail that our practical needs do not require us to fully acknowledge, allowing the impossible to coexist alongside the mundane in the very geography we inhabit and traverse. Imagine you are asked to estimate how many piano tuners exist in Chicago, a question that seems impossible to answer with precision because you lack complete information about the city's population, the number of pianos in households and institutions, how often they require maintenance, and the working capacity of each tuner throughout the year. This is the classic Fermi estimation problem, a technique named after physicist Enrico Fermi that encourages breaking down complex unknowns into smaller, manageable assumptions that can be multiplied together to approximate a reasonable answer. The paradox emerges when you realize that through this logical decomposition process, you often arrive at estimates that feel convincingly accurate despite being constructed almost entirely from guesses. And remarkably, these guesses frequently fall within the correct order of magnitude through pure mathematical coincidence rather than genuine knowledge. What makes this truly paradoxical is that the act of estimating through systematic reasoning creates an illusion of understanding so powerful that we begin to trust conclusions built on foundations of uncertainty. And yet these estimates often prove closer to reality than we have any rational right to expect them to be. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon operates through what might be called compensatory error distribution. When you make multiple rough assumptions in sequence, some of your estimates will be too high while others will be too low, and through the miraculous balancing act of multiplication, these individual errors frequently cancel each other out, leaving you with a result that obscures the genuine uncertainty at its core. We have normalized this paradox so thoroughly in scientific and professional contexts that entire decision-making processes now rest upon frameworks of educated guessing dressed in the language of analytical rigor, and we accept with barely a pause that we can make confident predictions about phenomena we understand only superficially, as if the mere act of writing down our assumptions transforms speculation into something resembling genuine knowledge. Imagine a moment from your childhood, a vivid memory so clear that you can see the colors, smell the air, and feel the emotions as though you were standing there again right now. Yet when you mention this memory to family members who were present that day, they look at you with confusion and tell you that what you remember simply did not happen that way, or perhaps did not happen at all, and when you insist upon the accuracy of your recollection. They produce photographs or documents that prove the event occurred in an entirely different manner than your mind has preserved it. This is the false memory paradox, and it presents us with a disturbing question about the nature of consciousness itself. If your memory feels absolutely authentic and emotionally real, but contradicts all external evidence and the recollections of others, which version of the past is actually true, and more unsettling still, how can your brain have constructed such a detailed and convincing false narrative without your knowledge or consent? The mechanism behind this phenomenon involves the brain's remarkable tendency to reconstruct memories each time they are recalled rather than retrieving them like files from a computer. And during this reconstruction process, the mind fills in gaps with plausible details, incorporates information learned after the original event, blends separate experiences together, and subtly reshapes the memory to align with your current beliefs and emotional needs. The brain does not distinguish between what actually happened and what you have been told happened, what you saw in photographs, what you dreamed, what you imagined might have happened, and what you wish had happened, and it treats all of these sources of information as equally valid input when rebuilding the memory. Imagine you are sitting in a room with just 23 other people, a seemingly ordinary gathering of strangers with no particular connection to one another. And yet if you were to ask how many of them share the same birthday, the statistical probability would tell you that there is more than a 50% chance that at least 2 people in that room were born on the exact same day of the year. Despite the fact that there are 365 possible days available for each person to be born upon, a mathematical reality that defies our intuitive sense of probability and causes most people to feel a deep sense of cognitive dissonance when they first encounter this concept. The mechanism that creates this paradox lies in the way our minds naturally calculate probability by focusing on the likelihood of one specific outcome, such as whether a particular person shares a birthday with you personally, rather than considering all possible pairings and combinations that could occur among the entire group, and when you account for every possible pair of people in a room of 23. The number of potential matches explodes exponentially from a simple 23 comparisons to 253 distinct pairings, each one offering an independent opportunity for a match to occur. And when you multiply these chances together using proper probability mathematics, the cumulative likelihood becomes far greater than our intuition would suggest. Imagine a society built upon the principle of absolute tolerance, where every voice is welcomed, every belief respected, and no viewpoint is ever silenced or rejected outright, because the foundational value is that tolerance itself must be extended to all ideas without exception or qualification. Yet within this framework emerges a troubling logical fracture. If we tolerate the intolerant, those who fundamentally reject the notion of tolerance itself, we create the conditions for the erosion and eventual destruction of the very tolerance we sought to protect and preserve. A group that advocates for the suppression of opposing voices, or the elimination of rights for certain populations, or the forced conformity of thought, uses the protective umbrella of tolerance to gain power and influence. And once that power is secured, they dismantle the tolerance that enabled their rise, leaving behind a system fundamentally opposed to the openness that allowed it to flourish. This is the mechanism at work. Tolerance contains within itself the seeds of its own negation, because absolute tolerance grants legitimacy to those whose explicit goal is the destruction of legitimacy itself. The paradox deepens when we recognize that any attempt to limit tolerance in order to preserve it seems to violate the very principle we are trying to save, creating a logical loop from which there appears to be no clean exit. We have largely normalized this contradiction by pretending it does not exist, by maintaining the fiction that we can somehow have infinite tolerance without boundaries, or by simply avoiding the moment when we must draw a line and acknowledge that some positions are fundamentally incompatible with the continuation of a tolerant society. Yet the question lingers in the background of our collective consciousness, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. At what point does tolerance become complicity, and how do we preserve what we value most without becoming the very thing we oppose? Imagine standing at the midpoint between two locations, and you decide to walk toward your destination, covering half the remaining distance with each step you take. And as you move forward, there will always be another half of the remaining distance left to traverse, and this continues infinitely, meaning mathematically you should never actually reach your destination, yet in lived experience you arrive without any difficulty whatsoever. Moving through the world with complete confidence that your legs will carry you to wherever you intend to go. This is Zeno's dichotomy paradox, one of the oldest conceptual impossibilities ever formulated, and it reveals a fundamental fracture between how mathematics describes reality and how we actually experience moving through it. The logical mechanism behind this paradox rests on the idea that infinite subdivision is not just a mathematical concept, but appears to be a requirement of physical reality itself. Since between any 2 points in space, there exists an infinite number of intermediate points, and yet somehow motion occurs fluidly, continuously, without hesitation or stuttering. Our minds process this by compartmentalizing the infinite into the manageable, by accepting that infinity can exist within finite boundaries, and that traversing infinite steps takes finite time, though we rarely articulate this acceptance consciously. We have normalized this paradox so completely that it has become invisible to us, absorbed into the background radiation of ordinary experience, and we simply move through our days, covering infinite distances with each stride, each handshake, each breath, never stopping to contemplate that we are completing impossible journeys every single moment. Imagine you are scrolling through your email inbox on a Monday morning, and you notice that you have received 347 unread messages, a number that seemed impossible just weeks ago when you had cleared everything to zero, and despite your best efforts to respond to each message individually. By the time you have answered 50 of them, another 100 have arrived in their place, creating a perpetual state of incompleteness that mirrors the ancient paradox of the swift runner who can never quite catch the tortoise because he must first cover half the remaining distance, then half of what remains after that, and so on infinitely, such that the goal recedes into an endless series of fractional pursuits. This modern instantiation of Zeno's paradox manifests not in motion across physical space, but rather in the accumulation of digital obligations, where each completed task spawns new tasks faster than they can be resolved, and the inbox becomes a philosophical problem made manifest in notifications and subject lines. The mechanism operates through what we might call the multiplication of fractionality, wherein the completion of work generates more work at a rate that exceeds our capacity to finish, creating what feels like an asymptotic approach toward being caught up, a state that exists theoretically but becomes practically unattainable. We experience this same pattern in social media feeds that never truly reach a bottom, in to-do lists that expand as we check items off, in conversations that branch into infinite tangents before any single thread can be resolved. Yet we have so thoroughly normalized this state of perpetual incompleteness that we rarely pause to recognize it as a genuine paradox at all, instead treating it as simply the condition of modern existence. Something to be managed through productivity applications and time management systems rather than recognized as a fundamental impossibility that our ancestors would have found utterly absurd, and in this normalization lies perhaps the deepest aspect of the paradox itself. We have accepted the impossible as routine. Consider a software application that has existed for 15 years, beginning as a simple desktop program written in an obsolete programming language by a team of developers who have all since retired or moved to other companies. Over those 15 years, every single line of original code has been replaced, rewritten, or refactored piece by piece until nothing remains of the original source except perhaps a single variable name or a comment buried deep within the architecture. The application has migrated from Windows to cloud infrastructure, from a monolithic structure to microservices, from one database system to another, from one continent's servers to a different continent entirely. Every component that made up the original software has been systematically replaced with modern equivalents that serve the same function but were written from scratch by entirely different people. Yet the application retains its identity, its name, its user base, and its continuity. Users still call it by the original name, still consider it the same product they began using decades ago, still expect its functionality to remain consistent despite the fact that technically nothing material from the original remains. The psychological mechanism operating here stems from our dependence on continuity of service and perceived identity rather than material composition. We have developed a conceptual framework where digital products exist as abstract entities defined by their role and function rather than their physical or code-level substrate. The paradox persists because we have collectively agreed that software identity resides in the continuity of purpose and user experience rather than in the actual implementation details that constitute its being. This normalization reveals something fundamental about how we have chosen to define identity in the digital age, opting for pragmatism and continuity over strict material or physical adherence, allowing us to accept that something can be completely reconstructed while remaining essentially unchanged. Consider the peculiar contradiction that emerges when we attempt to assign monetary value to human life, a practice that modern societies engage in routinely through insurance settlements, legal judgments, and cost-benefit analyses in public health decisions. Yet simultaneously, we maintain the cultural and moral conviction that human life is priceless and beyond quantification. A life insurance policy might declare that a person's existence is worth exactly $300,000, while in the next breath we proclaim that no amount of money could ever truly compensate for the loss of a loved one, creating a fundamental logical inconsistency at the heart of how we navigate mortality and grief. This paradox deepens when we observe that governments and institutions regularly assign different monetary values to different human lives based on age, earning potential, and nationality, suggesting that life has a calculable worth, yet we recoil morally from the explicit acknowledgement that some lives are worth more than others. The mechanism driving this contradiction lies in the collision between our need for practical systems that require numerical inputs and our deeper human instinct that rebels against reducing consciousness, relationships, and existence itself to mere currency. We have developed elaborate frameworks to make these calculations seem objective and fair, employing actuaries and economists to add scientific legitimacy to what is fundamentally a philosophical impossibility. Despite this cognitive dissonance, we have normalized the practice so thoroughly that most people navigate both positions simultaneously without recognizing the fundamental paradox, accepting life insurance contracts while also maintaining that their loved ones are irreplaceable, as though the two statements could somehow coexist in rational harmony. Imagine a factory owner who decides to upgrade their machinery to become twice as efficient, cutting their energy consumption in half for each unit produced, and yet somehow the factory ends up consuming more total energy than before. This is the essence of Jevons' paradox, named after the 19th century economist William Stanley Jevons, who observed that as steam engines became more efficient, coal consumption actually increased across Britain rather than decreased, as one might logically expect. The paradox emerges from a deceptively simple mechanism. When something becomes more efficient and therefore cheaper to use, people tend to use significantly more of it, often enough to completely offset and overwhelm the original efficiency gains. A person who buys a more fuel-efficient car might drive considerably more miles because the lower cost per mile makes driving more economically attractive, resulting in similar or even greater total fuel consumption. A company that implements energy-saving technology might expand production or add new services because the lower per-unit energy cost makes expansion more profitable and viable. This counterintuitive phenomenon reveals a fundamental truth about human economic behavior and resource allocation that persists despite our conscious awareness of it. We continue to pursue efficiency improvements as though they will automatically lead to conservation, yet we simultaneously continue to expand consumption whenever costs decrease, caught in a recursive loop where our victories against waste become paradoxically hollow. The psychological mechanism operates on both individual and systemic levels, where efficiency feels like progress and success, yet our behavior adaptation patterns ensure that the rebound effect captures much of what efficiency saves, leaving us perpetually surprised when conservation goals fail to materialize. Imagine a city with two main routes connecting a northern suburb to the southern business district, and every day thousands of commuters must choose between them, distributing themselves across both roads until an equilibrium forms where travel time is roughly equal on each path, approximately 45 minutes for most drivers. Now imagine that city planners, motivated by genuine concern for traffic congestion, decide to build a new road connecting these two routes, a shortcut that should theoretically make travel faster for everyone by providing an additional option. The new road is completed, ribbons are cut, and drivers are invited to use this fresh pathway, yet something counterintuitive happens. The average commute time increases to 55 minutes, making traffic worse for nearly every single person on the road. This is the Braess paradox, a phenomenon discovered by mathematician Dietrich Braess in 1968, which demonstrates that adding capacity to a network can paradoxically decrease overall performance when individual actors behave rationally according to their own self-interest. The mechanism underlying this apparent impossibility reveals itself when we consider that drivers always choose the route they believe will be fastest. And when a new road opens, many drivers who were previously on one of the original routes switch to the new shortcut because it appears faster from their individual perspective. Yet as more and more drivers make this same logical decision, the new road becomes congested, and importantly, some drivers who previously had fast paths now find themselves forced onto the overcrowded new connection, creating bottlenecks that propagate backwards through the entire system. What makes this paradox so psychologically unsettling is that it exposes the fundamental tension between individual rationality and collective well-being. For each driver making the locally optimal choice creates a globally suboptimal outcome, and the system reaches a new equilibrium that is demonstrably worse than the previous one. Imagine two prisoners held in separate cells, each unaware of what the other will do, each facing the same impossible choice: remain silent and protect your partner, or betray them to secure a lighter sentence for yourself. If both remain silent, they each serve 1 year. If one betrays while the other stays loyal, the betrayer walks free while the loyal prisoner serves 3 years. If both betray each other, they each serve 2 years. The logical choice seems obvious to each individual prisoner in isolation: betray, because no matter what the other person does, betrayal yields a better outcome than cooperation. Yet this cold logic produces the worst collective outcome, where both end up worse off than if they had simply trusted and cooperated. This is the prisoner's dilemma, a mathematical puzzle that reveals something deeply troubling about rational self-interest. And what makes this paradox so disorienting is that we encounter it constantly in real life without ever resolving it. Strangers on the road follow traffic laws not because it benefits them individually in that moment, but because mutual cooperation creates a system where everyone benefits more than they would through universal defection. Employees refrain from sabotaging colleagues not because individual sabotage wouldn't help them get ahead, but because the workplace functions only through a fragile agreement that everyone will mostly play fair. Nations maintain trade agreements and diplomatic relationships even when short-term betrayal might yield immediate advantages, because the alternative, a world of perpetual distrust and conflict, harms everyone including the betrayer. Yet the paradox persists because the temptation never fully disappears, and we have normalized living within this tension rather than resolving it, creating elaborate systems of reputation, punishment, and repeated interaction to keep people cooperating even when the mathematics of a single encounter suggest they shouldn't. We have built civilization on the hope that people will choose cooperation despite logic suggesting otherwise, and somehow, improbably, it mostly works. Imagine a classroom where a teacher announces at the beginning of the semester that there will be a surprise examination at some point before the final week, but the exact date remains unknown to all students. The examination cannot occur on the final day because then it would not be a surprise, as students would know with certainty when it must happen. Working backward through logic, it also cannot occur on the second to last day, because if it has not happened by then, students would know with absolute certainty it must occur that day, eliminating the surprise element entirely. Continuing this reasoning backward through each preceding day, one arrives at the logical conclusion that the surprise examination can never occur at all, because at any point when it arrives, students would have already deduced its inevitability through this same chain of reasoning. Yet in practice, when a teacher does announce such an examination, students remain genuinely uncertain. The examination happens, and they are indeed surprised, despite the logical paradox that suggests the entire situation should be impossible. The mechanism underlying this paradox stems from a flaw in self-referential reasoning. The very act of knowing that you have eliminated all possible dates through logical deduction would itself constitute knowledge that proves the examination is coming, and this knowledge becomes impossible to hold while maintaining the state of genuine uncertainty required for surprise. Our minds seem naturally inclined to abandon the rigorous logical chain at some point rather than hold both the deduction and the uncertainty simultaneously. This paradox persists in educational environments and in everyday life because humans operate intuitively rather than through perfect logical consistency, and we have normalized the acceptance of apparent contradictions when they serve practical purposes, allowing surprise examinations to continue startling students even though no such thing should logically exist. Imagine you have observed the sun rising every single morning of your entire life, without exception, stretching back through childhood and into the furthest reaches of your memory, and before that through countless generations of human observation recorded in history books and ancient texts, and you have come to the absolute conclusion that the sun will rise tomorrow morning just as it has risen every morning before. Yet nowhere in the universe does there exist a logical law that guarantees this will happen. For the future is not written into the fabric of reality by your past observations, and despite this fundamental gap between what you have seen and what must occur, you plan your entire life around this assumption, waking at a certain hour, scheduling your work, organizing your days with the complete confidence that this pattern will continue indefinitely. The problem of induction asks us to examine this strange gap between experience and certainty, between the thousands or millions of times something has happened and our unshakable belief that it will happen again, recognizing that no amount of repetition logically guarantees the next occurrence, that just because every swan you have ever seen has been white does not prove that black swans cannot exist somewhere in the universe. That just because every person you have known has required oxygen to survive does not logically necessitate that the next person born will also require it. Yet we cannot function as conscious beings without making these leaps from the particular to the universal, from the observed to the unobserved, and so we have normalized this paradox so completely that we rarely notice we are engaging in it, building our civilizations and sciences on foundations that cannot be logically justified. Trusting in patterns we cannot prove, accepting that induction is how we navigate reality, even while acknowledging that induction has no formal logical guarantee. And this contradiction sits at the very heart of human knowledge, rarely discussed, yet perpetually active in every assumption we make about tomorrow. Consider the peculiar phenomenon of the Grue paradox induction, wherein we find ourselves unable to articulate precisely what we fear in the darkness. Yet our fear remains entirely convincing and functionally real in its effects upon our nervous system and behavior. When you stand in complete darkness, perhaps in a basement or a room with all lights extinguished, a sense of dread emerges that seems disproportionate to the actual threats present, and you become convinced that some unnamed danger lurks just beyond your perception, something we might call the Grue, a creature so undefined that it has no specific form yet commands absolute terror. The psychological mechanism underlying this paradox operates through the exploitation of sensory deprivation combined with our evolved tendency to fill information gaps with threat narratives. When your visual cortex receives no data, your brain does not simply accept the absence but instead generates phantom threats, assembling fears from cultural memory, ancestral warnings, and the infinite possibilities of imagination. This process persists despite our complete logical understanding that darkness itself contains no inherent danger, that the statistics of harm in well-maintained indoor spaces remain vanishingly low, and that we can catalog every actual threat that might exist in such an environment. Yet we continue to move quickly through dark hallways, to avoid looking into shadowed corners, and to experience genuine physiological responses, including elevated heart rate and heightened startle response. Behaviors that serve no protective function whatsoever in modern environments where the actual dangers are minimal and often visible even in low light. Consider the moment when you observe a single black raven perched upon a telephone wire, and in that observation, you feel compelled to accept a logical truth that seems to expand far beyond what your eyes can actually verify, because the raven's paradox suggests that seeing one black raven somehow contributes evidence toward the statement that all ravens are black, which creates an unsettling sensation in your mind when you realize that by this same logic. Observing a white shoe also provides evidence that all ravens are black, since both statements are logically equivalent in their contrapositive forms, meaning that anything that is not black and not a raven becomes confirmation of a universal law about birds you have never fully examined. The psychological mechanism underlying this paradox rests upon our fundamental misunderstanding of how evidence actually accumulates and what confirmation truly means, because we assume that seeing a black raven directly supports the claim about ravens, while seeing a white shoe only trivially supports it, yet mathematically they carry equal weight in formal logic. And this disconnect between our intuition and mathematical truth creates a persistent cognitive dissonance that we rarely acknowledge in everyday conversation. What makes this paradox so deeply unsettling is that we have largely normalized our acceptance of evidence gathering without ever resolving this fundamental contradiction, allowing ourselves to simultaneously believe in the validity of logical confirmation while ignoring how absurd it becomes when we confront its full implications, so that each white shoe we observe technically makes it more likely that all ravens are black. A conclusion so counterintuitive that our minds refuse to process it as legitimate, yet logically defensible, leaving us in a state of perpetual intellectual compromise where we trust our systems of reasoning while suspecting they contain hidden flaws we cannot quite articulate or resolve. Consider the curious phenomenon of writing a preface to a book that has already been written, yet claiming that the preface was composed before the book itself existed, which creates an impossible temporal loop wherein the introduction must logically precede the text it introduces, and yet the author necessarily wrote the preface only after understanding the complete content that needed introducing, making the preface's claim of priority fundamentally dishonest despite being universally accepted as a normal literary convention that we encounter in nearly every substantial work of nonfiction and many works of fiction as well. The preface stands as a peculiar artifact of writing culture wherein the author addresses the reader with information about what is to come, yet this information could only have been gathered or formulated after the entire work was complete, creating a retroactive introduction that masquerades as a prospective one, a temporal sleight of hand performed openly and without apology. The psychological mechanism underlying this acceptance involves our willingness to adopt a fictional frame of reference wherein we pretend that the preface exists in a moment before we have read the book, even though both the preface and book were clearly written in reverse chronological order from their presentation to us. And we have collectively agreed to ignore this contradiction in the interest of maintaining a useful literary structure that genuinely does help orient readers toward the author's intentions and the work's central themes and arguments. Imagine you are standing in line at a convenience store, holding a lottery ticket among millions of others sold that week, and you find yourself genuinely believing that your ticket will not win the jackpot while simultaneously maintaining the hope that it might. This is the lottery paradox, a peculiar collision between rational belief and irrational desire that exists in the minds of millions of people every single day. You know with absolute mathematical certainty that the odds of your individual ticket winning are astronomically small, perhaps 1 in several hundred million, and yet you purchase the ticket anyway, and you allow yourself to entertain the possibility of winning, to imagine what you might do with the money, to feel a flutter of anticipation in your chest as the drawing approaches. The paradox emerges from this contradiction. You rationally believe you will lose, and you simultaneously, at some level of consciousness, believe you might win. The mechanism at work here involves what philosophers call the lottery belief problem, wherein rational belief in individual losing tickets appears incompatible with rational belief in someone winning. Your mind partitions these beliefs into separate chambers. You maintain them both simultaneously without allowing them to contaminate each other. This is possible because your rational mind operates on probability and statistics, while your emotional mind operates on possibility and narrative. You know that the lottery ticket is almost certainly worthless, yet you also know that winning is technically possible, and your brain weighs possibility more heavily than it should when hope is at stake. This paradox persists despite having no logical justification because it serves a psychological function, offering a temporary escape from the predictability of ordinary life, and because humans have evolved to be possibility-seeking creatures rather than probability-calculating machines. We have simply accepted this contradiction as a normal feature of human experience, a quirk we tolerate because the alternative would require us to abandon one of our most fundamental coping mechanisms. Consider the peculiar logical trap that emerges when we attempt to classify numbers as either interesting or boring, a mathematical curiosity that has fascinated philosophers and mathematicians for over a century. Imagine we line up all the natural numbers in sequence from 1 to infinity, and we decide to sort them into two distinct categories: those numbers that possess some remarkable property, some unusual characteristic, some distinctive feature that makes them worthy of attention and study, and those numbers that are entirely ordinary, completely unremarkable, utterly devoid of any special quality whatsoever. We might place numbers like 2, which is the only even prime, into the interesting category, or 7, which appears throughout human culture and mythology, or 6, which is the first perfect number with divisors that sum to itself. We place many numbers into the interesting pile, and the remaining numbers drift into the boring pile, those dull, forgettable integers that seem to possess no distinguishing features. But then we encounter the smallest number in the boring pile, whatever that number happens to be, and we immediately recognize that it is precisely because it is the smallest uninteresting number that it has become interesting. It is remarkable precisely because of its lack of remarks, distinctive because of its lack of distinction, worthy of attention because it should have been unworthy of attention. Once we acknowledge this quality, we must move it from the boring category to the interesting category. This creates a logical paradox, for now we look at the next smallest boring number and recognize the same problem again and infinitely again, until every number has been rescued from obscurity and promoted into the interesting category. And yet, intuitively, we know that not all numbers can be equally interesting, that some must be more mundane than others, that the very concept of interestingness requires a distribution across the spectrum. Imagine listening to two musical notes played in sequence, where the second note is somehow both higher and lower than the first at the same time, a phenomenon that exists in a peculiar acoustic space where your brain cannot definitively assign direction to the pitch movement. This is the tritone paradox, discovered by psychologist Diana Deutsch in 1986, and it represents one of the most unsettling contradictions in human auditory perception, where the same pair of tones can be heard as ascending by one listener while simultaneously being heard as descending by another listener in the same room. The paradox emerges from the structure of the chromatic scale itself, which wraps around in octaves, meaning that a note can be perceived as both higher and lower depending on which octave your brain assigns it to. And when Deutsch constructed her famous shepherd tones, she created an acoustic illusion where the pitch seems to continuously rise or fall without ever actually reaching a destination. What makes this truly paradoxical is that two individuals listening to identical audio will often report completely opposite perceptions, yet both are hearing the same physical sound waves entering their ears, suggesting that the direction of pitch movement is not encoded in the sound itself, but rather constructed entirely within the listener's mind. The psychological mechanism appears to involve how your brain resolves ambiguity when it encounters tones that sit at the edge of perceptual clarity, where both ascending and descending interpretations are equally valid according to the acoustic information available, forcing your auditory cortex to make an essentially arbitrary choice based on subtle individual differences in how you weight different frequencies or organize tonal space. Research has shown that this perception correlates with handedness, language background, and even the listener's early musical training, yet there remains no complete understanding of why these factors should influence something as fundamental as the direction of pitch movement. Consider the moment when you are asked to estimate something you cannot possibly know with precision, such as how many piano tuners exist in Chicago, or how many golf balls would fit inside a school bus, or what percentage of the Earth's surface is covered by water when you have not looked up the actual figure. Your mind springs into action with surprising confidence, breaking down the problem into smaller, more manageable components, making rough assumptions about population density or volume calculations, and arriving at a number that feels reasonable, even plausible. Yet here emerges the paradox that defines Enrico Fermi's famous approach to estimation. We synthesize answers from almost nothing, from fragmentary knowledge and casual intuition, and we do so with such apparent certainty that we often fail to recognize how much we are simply guessing. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon involves a kind of confident extrapolation where our brain treats partial information as sufficient foundation for comprehensive conclusions, weaving together loose threads of knowledge into what feels like a coherent tapestry. We break large unknowns into smaller ones, estimate each component with whatever data points we can recall or reasonably assume, multiply and divide our way forward, and emerge with a final number that our minds treat as having genuine weight and authority. The paradox deepens when we consider that these estimates are frequently useful despite their uncertain foundation, that they often fall within the correct order of magnitude even when constructed from assumptions we cannot fully justify, and that we have normalized this entire process as a legitimate form of reasoning. We rarely pause to acknowledge the gulf between the confidence we feel in our estimates and the actual validity of the mental pathways we use to construct them, accepting instead that educated guessing and systematic decomposition of uncertainty somehow transform intuition into insight. Imagine a future in which technology has advanced to the point where your consciousness can be scanned with perfect accuracy, every neuron mapped, every synapse recorded, every quantum state of your brain preserved in crystalline detail, and then this complete informational pattern is transmitted across space and reconstructed atom for atom in a new biological or synthetic substrate, creating what appears to be an exact duplicate of you with all your memories intact and all your personality traits preserved. The original body may be destroyed in the process, or it may remain alive, but the question that emerges from this scenario is both simple and profoundly unsettling. Are you the one who wakes up in the new body, or does your subjective experience end at the moment of transfer while only a copy believes itself to be you? This is the Moravec transfer paradox, named after the roboticist Hans Moravec who explored this problem, and it reveals a peculiar tension between what we might call the functional view of consciousness and the phenomenological view. From a third-person perspective, nothing has been lost. The copy is functionally identical to the original, with the same memories, the same personality, the same everything that we normally use to identify a person as themselves. And yet the subjective first-person experience, the raw sensation of being you right now in this moment, seems like something that cannot simply be copied or transferred like data, as though consciousness is not merely information, but something tied to the continuous causal chain of your particular body and brain, something that persists through time by remaining the same substrate rather than by being duplicated elsewhere. Consider the moment when you arrive at your office building on an ordinary Tuesday morning and glance at the clock on the wall, which reads 8:45, and you form the belief that it is 8:45. And based on this belief, you conclude that you are late for your meeting. So you rush upstairs with a sense of urgency and dread, only to discover later that the clock had actually stopped at 8:45 the previous evening. And by pure coincidence, the actual time when you looked at it was indeed 8:45, meaning your belief was true, yet your belief was formed through a faulty process of reasoning based on misleading information. This scenario captures the essence of what philosophers call the Gettier problem, a paradox that demonstrates how a belief can be both true and justified, yet somehow fail to constitute genuine knowledge. The mechanism at work here involves the collision between our intuitive understanding of knowledge and the formal logical definitions we have constructed to describe it, for we have long believed that knowledge requires three components. The belief must be true, the belief must be justified, and the belief must be held by a knowing subject. Yet the Gettier problem reveals that these three conditions, while necessary, are not sufficient to guarantee actual knowledge, because a belief can satisfy all three criteria and still feel like it lacks something essential, some component that separates genuine knowledge from lucky guessing dressed up in the garments of justified true belief. Imagine a democratic election where three candidates stand before the voters, and the people are asked to rank their preferences from first choice to third choice, a seemingly straightforward exercise in collective decision-making that should produce a clear winner reflecting the will of the majority. Yet when the votes are tallied and the preferences are compared pairwise, something deeply unsettling emerges. Candidate A is preferred over candidate B by a majority of voters, candidate B is preferred over candidate C by a majority of voters, and in a logical world, this would mean that candidate A should be preferred over candidate C by a majority as well. But instead, candidate C is preferred over candidate A by a majority of voters. This circularity has no winner and no logical resolution, a mathematical impossibility that somehow manifests in the real world of human preference and collective choice. Discovered by the 18th century French mathematician and philosopher the Marquis de Condorcet, who realized that majority voting, despite its democratic appeal, can produce outcomes that violate the basic principle of transitivity upon which all rational decision-making depends. The mechanism behind this paradox lies in the aggregation of individual preferences into a collective preference, where the sum of rational individual choices creates an irrational collective outcome that none of the voters themselves would endorse. When voters hold diverse preference orderings that are individually rational and logically consistent, the simple act of counting votes through pairwise comparisons can generate cycles of preference that have no clear resolution, no candidate that genuinely represents the will of the people in any meaningful sense. The problem arises not from voter irrationality, but from the mathematical structure of preference aggregation itself, where the democratic principle of majority rule, applied repeatedly, can contradict itself and produce outcomes that seem to have no logical foundation. Imagine a classroom where a teacher must distribute limited resources, textbooks, computers, and study materials, among 30 students with vastly different needs and learning styles, and the teacher faces an impossible constraint. Any decision to give more resources to one student automatically means taking resources away from another. Yet somehow the teacher is expected to reach a state where no student can be made better off without making another student worse off, which is the definition of Pareto efficiency. And yet in real life, no such perfect balance ever truly exists, because the moment you achieve it for one metric, 3 other metrics collapse into dysfunction, creating a paradox where optimization in one dimension inevitably creates suboptimal outcomes in others. This phenomenon extends far beyond classrooms into economics, healthcare systems, urban planning, and organizational management, where decision-makers constantly encounter the impossibility of satisfying all stakeholders simultaneously without degrading conditions for someone else. And the deeper mechanism reveals itself through the realization that Pareto efficiency assumes a static, unchanging set of preferences and constraints, but human systems are dynamic, adaptive, and evolving. Meaning that the moment you think you have achieved that perfect state where no one can benefit without harming another, someone's needs shift, priorities change, external circumstances alter, and the entire calculation becomes invalid once more. Imagine a conversation between Achilles, the swift warrior of ancient legend, and a tortoise who moves with deliberate slowness, a dialogue that occurs not on a racetrack but within the realm of pure reasoning itself. The tortoise presents Achilles with a logical argument, one that appears sound and follows all the rules of deduction, yet the tortoise claims it will never be convinced by the conclusion, no matter how perfectly the premises are constructed. Achilles insists that if A equals B and B equals C, then logically A must equal C, and the tortoise agrees with each step individually, agreeing that A equals B is true and that B equals C is true. Yet when asked to accept that A equals C, the tortoise simply requests yet another intermediate step, another rule to bridge the gap, an infinite regress of logical scaffolding that can never quite be completed. This is not a failure of the tortoise's reasoning abilities, but rather a demonstration of a profound gap between logical rules themselves and the act of accepting their conclusions, a space where even perfect adherence to every logical law leaves something fundamentally unconvinced within the mind. We encounter this paradox in our own intellectual lives whenever we find ourselves knowing something to be logically true yet unable to fully internalize it, when we understand a mathematical proof completely but still feel uncertain about its conclusion, or when we can articulate every reason why a belief should change, yet find ourselves unchanged by those very reasons. The mechanism operates through a distinction between following a rule and acting upon its implications, between acknowledging each link in a logical chain and committing to the path it carves through reality. We have normalized this strange persistence by separating logic from psychology, as though truth and belief are 2 different currencies that need not exchange at the same rate, as though understanding something intellectually requires no corresponding transformation in how we actually navigate the world around us. Imagine a universe so perfectly sealed, so mathematically precise in its isolation, that every particle, every wave of energy, every photon that has ever existed will eventually return to its exact original position and state, creating an infinite cycle where all moments repeat eternally without variation or mercy. This is the Poincaré recurrence theorem, a legitimate mathematical principle derived from the laws of thermodynamics and classical mechanics, which suggests that in a finite, isolated system with a finite number of possible states, the system must eventually return to a state arbitrarily close to its initial condition, given sufficient time. The paradox deepens when we apply this concept to the universe itself, for if our cosmos is indeed finite and closed, then theoretically, every configuration of matter and energy that has ever existed will recur infinitely many times across the expanse of eternity. You are reading these words now, and according to this principle, there will come a moment billions upon billions of years hence when atoms will align in precisely the configuration they hold at this very second, recreating this exact instant with absolute fidelity, and then it will happen again, and again, without beginning and without end. The psychological mechanism that allows this paradox to persist in our minds without causing complete existential paralysis is our refusal to truly internalize timescales so incomprehensibly vast that they render the concept of recurrence functionally identical to non-existence. We have normalized this impossibility by treating it as a mathematical curiosity rather than a genuine description of reality, tucking it away into the specialized domain of theoretical physics where it cannot disturb our daily experience. Yet the recurrence remains logically sound, mathematically unavoidable, and utterly indifferent to our preference for linear time and singular moments. Consider the peculiar moment when you wake up in the morning and decide to get out of bed, fully convinced that you have chosen to do so, that this action flows from your own autonomous will and desire, yet simultaneously every neuroscientist studying your brain in that exact instant can point to the cascade of electrochemical events that preceded your conscious awareness of this choice, suggesting that your brain had already decided before you became conscious of deciding. You experience yourself as a free agent navigating the world through deliberate choices, holding yourself accountable for your decisions, praising yourself for good ones, and feeling genuine regret for poor ones. Yet the deeper we examine the physical substrate of consciousness, the more we discover that every thought, every impulse, every apparent decision emerges from prior causes stretching infinitely backward through time. From genetics and childhood experiences and neurological structures you never chose to have. This clash persists in the human psyche with remarkable resilience, existing comfortably in most minds without triggering the existential crisis it logically should, because we have evolved the capacity to hold contradictory frameworks simultaneously, to experience the phenomenological reality of choice and agency, while intellectually accepting that every event follows necessarily from what came before. The mechanism behind this paradox lies in the profound gap between subjective experience and objective reality, between the conscious mind's narrative of deliberation and decision-making and the mechanical processes of the brain operating according to natural law. Imagine you are standing at one end of a hallway and you wish to reach the opposite wall. Before you can arrive at your destination, you must first travel half the distance to that wall. Once you have covered that half distance, you must then travel half of the remaining distance. After accomplishing this, you are confronted with yet another half distance that must be traversed before you can proceed further. This process continues infinitely, creating an endless series of halfway points that must be reached before any forward progress can truly be made. According to the ancient Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea, this infinite subdivision of space presents a logical impossibility, for how can you complete an infinite number of tasks in finite time? The paradox suggests that motion itself should be impossible, that you should never actually reach the wall, trapped instead in an endless cycle of approaching without ever arriving. The mechanism underlying this paradox operates through the mathematical principle of infinite series and the human tendency to conflate mathematical abstraction with physical reality. When we divide a distance into infinitely many parts, we assume that completing infinitely many tasks must therefore require infinite time. Yet mathematicians have long since demonstrated that infinite series can converge to finite sums, meaning that infinite subdivisions of space can be traversed in finite duration. Our minds struggle with infinity because we have evolved to perceive and navigate discrete, finite quantities in the world around us, and the concept of completing infinite actions instantaneously feels intuitively wrong, even though it is mathematically and physically sound. What persists about this paradox despite its logical resolution is our deep psychological attachment to discrete, countable steps and our lingering discomfort with the infinite. A discomfort so fundamental that even knowing the mathematical answer does not entirely dispel the subtle unease that accompanies contemplating endless subdivisions collapsing into a single moment of arrival. Imagine standing at the edge of an infinite staircase, where you must complete an infinite number of tasks before you can rest, yet you somehow manage to accomplish them all in finite time, and this is not a metaphor, but rather a genuine logical structure that philosophers and mathematicians have grappled with for centuries. This is the essence of the supertask paradox, where an infinite sequence of discrete actions, each taking progressively less time than the one before it, somehow condenses into a finite duration that allows completion. Picture a worker tasked with painting an infinitely long hallway, painting the first section in 1 minute, the second section in half a minute, the third section in a quarter minute, and so forth, doubling their speed with each successive segment, until by the mathematical limit they have painted the entire infinite hallway in exactly 2 minutes. The logical mechanism that permits this seemingly impossible feat lies in the convergent infinite series, where the sum of infinitely many diminishing quantities approaches a finite limit, much like how 0.09 repeating mathematically equals 1 despite never quite reaching it through conventional addition. Our minds rebel against this because we operate in the realm of discrete, countable time, where one thing follows another in sequential consciousness, and we cannot genuinely experience or verify the completion of infinite steps within our finite awareness. Yet this structure persists not as a flaw in mathematics, but as a fundamental property of certain numerical systems, revealing that our intuitive sense of completion and finiteness diverges sharply from the abstract reality of convergent processes. We have normalized this paradox by compartmentalizing it into pure mathematics, relegating it to theoretical frameworks where its strangeness feels less threatening, though it continues to challenge our deepest assumptions about causality, agency, and the nature of accomplishment itself. Imagine a peculiar lamp that exists in a state of infinite switching, controlled by a being with infinite speed and patience who operates according to a very specific pattern. During the first half minute, the lamp turns on, then during the next quarter minute, it turns off, then during the next eighth of a minute, it turns on again, then during the next 16th of a minute, it turns off, and this process continues infinitely, with each interval taking half the duration of the previous one, so that by the end of exactly 1 full minute, an infinite number of on and off switches have occurred. And yet, when you observe the lamp at the precise moment that 1 minute has elapsed, you must answer the question, is the lamp on or is it off? The mathematical reality is that all these intervals sum to exactly 1 minute through the infinite geometric series, meaning the switching completes within finite time despite occurring infinitely many times. Yet the lamp exists in a state where logic itself seems to fracture because the final position depends entirely on whether the last action in the infinite sequence was an on switch or an off switch, and since there is no final switch in an infinite sequence, no definitive answer can be determined through pure logic alone. What makes this paradox so deeply unsettling is that it reveals how our physical intuitions about causation and state collapse when confronted with infinite processes occurring in finite intervals, and our minds struggle because we expect that any physical system must have some determinable state at any given moment. Yet Thomson's construction proves that the mathematical completion of infinite actions need not logically determine a clear outcome. Consider the peculiar situation where a mathematical system, when examined from within itself, appears to contain infinite objects of a certain kind, yet when that same system is observed from outside by a larger framework, those supposedly infinite objects collapse into a countable, finite set that can theoretically be listed one by one. This is Skolom's paradox infinity, a conceptual knot that arises from the foundations of set theory and the nature of mathematical description itself. The paradox emerges when we construct what mathematicians call a countable model of set theory, which means we build a version of the entire mathematical universe that contains only countably many objects. Yet within this model, there exists a set that is provably uncountable according to the model's own internal logic and rules. From the perspective of someone working entirely within the model, consulting only the axioms and theorems available to them, this set is genuinely infinite and uncountable, incomprehensibly vast and beyond enumeration. But from the perspective of an outside observer who can see the entire model as a finished structure, that supposedly uncountable set is merely a countable collection, something that could theoretically be written down in a complete list given enough time and space. The mechanism driving this paradox lies in the fundamental relativity of what we mean by the word infinite, by what we mean by countable, by what we mean by existence itself. Infinity is not an absolute property, but rather a relational one, dependent entirely on the framework from which you are making the observation. The axioms and definitions that govern mathematical truth are themselves tools of description, and what constitutes a proof of uncountability within one system may appear as merely a clever arrangement of finite objects when viewed from a sufficiently external vantage point. Imagine walking into a barbershop on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, and you notice something peculiar about the barber himself. His hair is noticeably unkempt, uneven, and poorly maintained, despite the fact that he spends his entire day cutting and styling the hair of others with meticulous precision and care. You observe customers arriving with disheveled locks and departing with freshly trimmed, perfectly shaped haircuts, yet the man responsible for their transformation walks around with hair that appears as though it has never seen a proper cut in months. This is the essence of the barbershop paradox, a logical impossibility that has persisted throughout human civilization, embodying a fundamental contradiction in how we apply our skills and expertise. The barber cannot cut his own hair as effectively as he cuts others' hair because the act of cutting one's own hair requires a reversed perspective, awkward angles, mirror distortions, and a complete loss of the objective viewpoint that makes his professional expertise so valuable. When he looks into the mirror, he sees a reversed image that conflicts with how others perceive his head in three-dimensional space, making symmetry and proportion nearly impossible to judge accurately. Yet despite this obvious logical explanation for why his hair remains perpetually neglected, we continue to find the paradox unsettling and somewhat absurd, because it violates our intuitive sense that mastery should be universally applicable. The deeper mechanism at work here involves the distinction between theoretical knowledge and practical application, between the ability to perceive problems in others and the ability to perceive them in oneself, a cognitive limitation that extends far beyond barbershops into medicine, psychology, parenting, and virtually every domain of human expertise. We have somehow normalized this contradiction so thoroughly that we rarely acknowledge how strange it truly is, accepting without question that the most skilled craftspeople are often the worst judges of their own work, trapped in a perspective that makes objective self-assessment essentially impossible. Imagine a laboratory where physicists conduct the delayed choice quantum eraser experiment, a real and reproducible phenomenon in which a particle's past behavior appears to change based on a measurement decision made in the future, long after the particle has already interacted with the apparatus. In this setup, a photon travels through a double slit, creating an interference pattern that suggests it took both paths simultaneously. Yet the moment a detector is placed to determine which slit it actually passed through, the interference pattern collapses into two distinct bands, as though the particle retroactively chose a definite path. But here is where the paradox deepens into something that troubles the mind. If you place that detector after the photon has already been measured elsewhere in the experiment, and then you later erase the information about which path the photon took, the original interference pattern mysteriously reappears, as though the photon traveled backward through time to change its own history based on knowledge that did not exist when it first passed through the slits. The psychological mechanism at work involves our profound dependence on temporal causality, the unshakable intuition that causes must precede effects, that the future cannot influence the past, and that information about what has already happened cannot be retroactively unmade or rewritten. Yet quantum mechanics suggests that at the subatomic level, the universe operates according to principles that fundamentally challenge this assumption, making the very notion of a fixed past somewhat illusory. We have normalized this paradox by accepting it as mathematically consistent and experimentally verified, by treating it as merely counterintuitive rather than impossible, and by compartmentalizing it as a problem that only affects particles too small to matter in our everyday experience. And yet the question lingers in the darkness of contemplation. If the universe itself permits the future to retroactively erase the past at the quantum level, how certain can we truly be about any history that we believe has already solidified into unchanging fact? Imagine you are standing in a laboratory where physicists have arranged an extraordinarily delicate experiment involving a theoretical bomb that is triggered by a single photon of light, and the question they pose is this: can we determine whether the bomb is real without actually detonating it? This is the essence of the Elitzur-Vaidman bomb test, a thought experiment that emerged from quantum mechanics in the 1980s, and it describes a scenario where observation itself exists in a paradoxical state between interaction and non-interaction. The setup involves splitting a beam of light into two paths using a half-silvered mirror, and if the bomb is real, it will absorb a photon from one path and trigger an explosion. Yet if we arrange the interference patterns correctly, we can sometimes determine the bomb is functional without the photon ever reaching it directly. What makes this paradox so deeply unsettling is that it suggests we can gain information about reality through a path that was never taken, extracting knowledge through the absence of an event rather than its presence. The logical mechanism underlying this phenomenon rests on quantum superposition and the strange nature of measurement, where particles exist in multiple states simultaneously until observed, and the very act of asking a question about which path a particle takes forces reality to commit to an answer. We have normalized this bizarre principle across decades of quantum experimentation, building entire technologies like quantum computers upon foundations that suggest reality does not possess definite properties until someone checks. Yet we continue our daily lives as though the world exists independently of our observation. The Elitzur-Vaidman test persists in our consciousness not because it becomes less strange with repetition, but because we have slowly accepted that strangeness is simply the texture of how existence operates at its most fundamental level. And perhaps the true paradox is not the bomb test itself, but rather our capacity to construct mental frameworks that accommodate impossibilities while we drift toward sleep. Imagine yourself presented with two separate choices, each offering different lottery outcomes, and notice how your preferences seem to shift depending on the presentation of probabilities, even though the underlying mathematics remains perfectly consistent. In the first scenario, you are offered a choice between Lottery A, which gives you a guaranteed 99% chance of winning $1 million with a 1% chance of winning nothing at all, or Lottery B, which offers you a 100% guarantee of $1 million. Most rational people instinctively choose the cert million, finding the security comforting despite the minimal expected value difference. Yet in the second scenario, when presented with Lottery C, which offers a 1% chance of winning $1 million and a 99% chance of winning nothing, compared to Lottery D, which offers a 1% chance of winning $1 million and a 99% chance of winning nothing, suddenly people's preferences reverse, choosing the lottery with slightly better odds despite the probabilities being mathematically identical to the first choice. This reversal reveals what economist Maurice Allais discovered. Our brains do not process risk according to rational expected utility theory, but instead employ psychological shortcuts that create internal contradictions in our decision-making frameworks. The mechanism underlying this paradox stems from how our minds overweight certain outcomes relative to probable ones, a phenomenon known as the certainty effect, which causes us to disproportionately value guaranteed results even when the overall expected value remains nearly identical. We also experience what researchers call the pseudo-certainty effect, where identical probabilities feel psychologically different depending on whether they represent a guaranteed outcome or one among many competing possibilities. Imagine a casino in the city of St. Petersburg where a peculiar game of chance has been devised, one that promises infinite expected winnings yet remains perpetually unprofitable in practice, a paradox that has haunted probability theory for nearly 3 centuries and continues to perplex mathematicians and philosophers alike. In this game, a fair coin is flipped repeatedly until it lands on tails, and the player receives a payout equal to $2 if tails appears on the first flip, $4 if it appears on the second flip, $8 if on the third, and so forth, doubling with each additional flip, creating an exponential progression of potential rewards. When you calculate the expected value of this game mathematically, you must sum the probability of each outcome multiplied by its corresponding payout. 1/2 times $2, plus 1/4 times $4, plus 1/8 times $8, and continuing infinitely, which yields $1 plus $1 plus $1 ad infinitum, suggesting the game is worth an infinite amount of money to play. Yet in reality, no rational person would pay even a modest sum like $25 to participate in this game, because the actual probability of receiving enormous payouts becomes astronomically small, and most plays will end within the first few flips, yielding minimal returns that could never justify the entry fee, creating a chasm between what pure mathematics declares and what human intuition and empirical reality insist upon. The mechanism underlying this paradox lies in the nature of infinite series and exponential distributions, where the mathematical framework produces a logically consistent answer that somehow fails to capture the true utility of the situation, demonstrating that expected value alone may not be the appropriate measure for evaluating real-world decisions involving uncertainty and limited resources. Imagine filling two identical containers with water, one at room temperature and one heated to near boiling, then placing both into a freezer at exactly the same moment, and observing with genuine bewilderment as the hot water reaches its frozen state before the cold water does, a phenomenon that seems to violate every principle of thermodynamics that we have come to understand and rely upon in our everyday perception of how the physical world operates. This is the Mpemba effect, named after an East African student who observed this counterintuitive occurrence in the 1960s, though the observation itself dates back centuries to Aristotle and was documented by various natural philosophers throughout history who watched in confusion as hot liquid froze faster than cold liquid in seemingly identical circumstances. The mechanism behind this paradox remains partially mysterious to modern science, though several competing theories attempt to explain the phenomenon through the lens of convection currents, where hot water creates more vigorous circulation patterns that promote more efficient heat dissipation, or through the expansion and contraction properties that cause hot water to have different molecular arrangements and hydrogen bonding patterns that somehow accelerate the freezing process despite the apparent absurdity of the concept. Some researchers propose that supercooling plays a role, suggesting that colder water becomes trapped in a metastable state where it remains liquid below its freezing point until disturbed, while hot water avoids this trap entirely by cooling gradually and crossing the freezing threshold without hesitation or delay. Imagine a physicist named Wigner sitting in a laboratory while his colleague, whom we might call his friend, conducts an experiment inside a sealed chamber observing the quantum state of a particle. The friend measures the particle and obtains a definite result, collapsing its wave function from a superposition of multiple states into one concrete outcome. From the friend's perspective, the measurement is complete, the observation is finished, and reality has been determined. However, Wigner, observing the entire sealed chamber from outside, has not opened it to verify what his friend measured. From Wigner's perspective, the friend and the particle and the entire experimental apparatus exist in a superposition of all possible measurement outcomes until Wigner himself makes an observation. This creates a profound paradox where two observers, separated only by the walls of a room, inhabit completely different realities. The friend has collapsed the wave function through measurement, yet Wigner's observation of the unopened chamber suggests the wave function remains uncollapsed. Both observers cannot simultaneously be correct about the state of reality, yet quantum mechanics offers no clear mechanism for deciding whose observation is the valid one. This paradox persists in the foundations of physics because it reveals a deep asymmetry in how quantum theory treats observers and observations. We have normalized this conceptual impossibility by simply accepting that reality might depend on the observer, that consciousness or measurement might be fundamental to existence itself, or by adopting interpretations where multiple realities branch into separate universes. Yet beneath these explanations lies an unresolved tension. At what point does observation become real, and who decides whether another observer's measurement counts as genuine reality or merely potential information waiting for further verification? Imagine two particles that were once connected, now separated by vast distances across the universe, yet somehow instantaneously aware of each other's state when measured, as if an invisible thread of information travels faster than light itself, violating everything we understand about the speed limit of the cosmos. In 1935, Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen proposed this thought experiment to challenge quantum mechanics, suggesting that such instantaneous correlation between distant particles seemed impossible, and therefore quantum mechanics must be incomplete, that hidden variables must exist to explain this strange entanglement. Yet decades of experiments have confirmed that this phenomenon is real, that particles genuinely do influence each other across any distance instantly, that the universe fundamentally allows what classical physics deemed absolutely forbidden. The logical mechanism behind this paradox rests on the collision between two seemingly irreconcilable truths: that nothing can travel faster than light according to relativity, and yet information about quantum states appears to do exactly that when entangled particles are measured. We have learned to accept this by reframing it, by saying that no usable information travels faster than light because the results appear random until compared. Yet the correlation itself, the fundamental linking of distant realities, remains instantaneous and real regardless of our semantic gymnastics. What persists is our normalization of this impossibility through mathematical formalism and experimental verification, allowing us to live in a universe where distance is simultaneously meaningful and irrelevant, where locality itself becomes a suggestion rather than a law, and where the very fabric of separation dissolves at the quantum level, leaving us to wonder whether separation is truly fundamental or merely an illusion we constructed to make sense of a reality far stranger than our minds were designed to comprehend. Imagine standing in a room where a quantum system exists in superposition, a state of simultaneous possibilities, and you must choose how to measure it, knowing that your choice of measurement apparatus fundamentally determines which properties of reality become real while others vanish into potentiality forever. This is the essence of the preferred basis problem, a paradox that reveals how the universe seems to require us to make arbitrary decisions about which questions we ask nature, as if reality itself is waiting for us to decide what it should become. In the mathematics of quantum mechanics, any measurement can be performed using infinitely many different bases, different coordinate systems through which we could observe the same physical system, and yet the moment we choose one particular basis, we collapse the wave function into that framework, making certain properties manifest while rendering others permanently inaccessible. The paradox deepens when we realize that nothing in the fundamental laws of physics tells us which basis should be the preferred one, which way of looking at the world should take precedence over all others, and yet without making this arbitrary choice, we cannot extract any definite information from nature at all. The mechanism underlying this problem rests on the gap between the mathematical formalism that describes quantum systems with complete indifference to any particular measurement basis, and the practical necessity that conscious observation or physical interaction must occur through some specific apparatus, some particular orientation of our instruments, some chosen perspective that privileges one set of questions above the infinite alternatives. Consider the universe as it exists in this moment, a vast arrangement of particles in a particular configuration, with stars burning in specific locations and matter distributed according to precise physical laws, and then imagine that this exact same universe, down to the position of every atom and every photon, could theoretically arise spontaneously from pure chaos through nothing but random statistical fluctuations, a phenomenon known as a Boltzmann fluctuation. Which means that the ordered cosmos we observe and inhabit might not be the natural product of billions of years of gradual entropy increase from an orderly Big Bang, but rather a temporary island of improbability that spontaneously assembled itself from disorder through sheer mathematical chance. Imagine that you're living your life, making choices that feel entirely free and spontaneous, yet somehow the same fundamental patterns repeat across your existence with only minor variations in their details. You meet different people in different places, yet the emotional arc of each relationship follows an eerily similar trajectory, the same conflicts emerging, the same resolutions playing out, the same ultimate endings occurring as though scripted by an invisible hand. You make career decisions that feel novel and unprecedented, yet find yourself in nearly identical professional dynamics, encountering the same types of colleagues, the same ethical dilemmas, the same cycles of motivation and burnout, as though you have lived this particular chapter dozens of times before with only the names and dates changed. This is the paradox of stochastic eternal return, where randomness itself becomes the mechanism through which the universe ensures that all meaningful patterns recur infinitely, not as exact replications, but as probabilistic echoes, variations on eternal themes played out through the kaleidoscope of apparent chance. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon operates through the recognition that truly random systems, when given infinite iterations or sufficient complexity, must eventually revisit their previous states and configurations. Human consciousness, being pattern recognition machinery evolved over millions of years, naturally gravitates toward detecting these recurring structures, these rhyming moments in our lives, creating a feedback loop where we become hypertuned to similarities and dismiss genuine differences as inconsequential variations. Imagine a pharmaceutical company testing a new drug treatment across two hospitals, and when you examine the data separately at each location, the drug appears superior to the placebo in both places. Yet when you combine all the data together, the placebo suddenly emerges as the more effective treatment, defying what you just observed in the individual results. This is Simpson's paradox, a statistical phenomenon where a trend that appears in several different groups of data reverses itself when those groups are combined together, creating a logical impossibility that somehow manages to be entirely real and mathematically valid. The paradox emerges not from mathematical error, but from the different sizes of the groups being compared, because when you aggregate data without accounting for the varying proportions of patients in each hospital or the varying severity of cases treated at each location, you create a hidden variable that completely inverts your conclusions. What makes this phenomenon so profoundly disorienting is that both interpretations are technically correct at the same time. The trend exists at the micro level, and its inverse exists at the macro level, and there is no mathematical mistake anywhere in the analysis. The brain struggles to accept that disaggregated data and aggregated data can tell fundamentally opposite stories about the same underlying reality, because our intuition insists that combining more information should only make our picture clearer, not invert it entirely. Simpson's paradox persists in real-world decision-making precisely because we rarely think to disaggregate our data or question the composition of our comparison groups. We accept the aggregate conclusion and implement policies based on reversed causality, and the paradox remains hidden until someone pauses to examine the underlying structure. Imagine standing in a teleportation chamber on Earth, preparing to be transported to a space station orbiting Mars. And as the technician counts down, you wonder whether the person who arrives at the destination will truly be you, or simply an exact copy of you while you die here in this chamber. Derek Parfit's teleportation paradox presents a scenario where a machine scans every atom and molecule of your body, destroys the original in the process, and reconstructs an atom-for-atom duplicate at the destination. And the philosophical terror that grips us is the question of whether identity persists through this process, or whether you have actually been murdered and replaced with someone who merely thinks they are you and remembers your memories. The mechanism that makes this paradox so psychologically disturbing rests on our intuitive understanding that personal identity requires continuity, that there must be an unbroken chain of consciousness linking the you of yesterday to the you of today, and yet the duplicate would have exactly this sense of continuity from their perspective, their memories flowing seamlessly from the point before teleportation to the point after, their subjective experience completely uninterrupted. While the original you would experience nothing but cessation. We have normalized similar anxieties in modern life by accepting that our cells are replaced constantly, that the atoms composing you now are not the atoms that composed you 7 years ago. Yet we insist you are still you, the same person, and somehow this biological trolley trick feels acceptable to us even as the teleportation scenario produces existential dread. Perhaps because gradual replacement preserves the illusion of continuity while instantaneous copying makes the discontinuity impossible to ignore, and we live with this contradiction suspended in our minds without resolution, accepting both that we are not the same atoms and that we are somehow still ourselves, a paradox we have learned to carry without ever truly resolving it. Imagine a version of yourself that exists in a branching universe where every quantum outcome that keeps you alive becomes the only reality you can ever experience, creating a subjective immortality that feels indistinguishable from eternal life, even though everyone else around you sees you aging and dying normally. This is the paradox of quantum suicide immortality, a thought experiment that emerges from the intersection of quantum mechanics, the many worlds interpretation, and human consciousness. The mechanism works like this. If the universe truly splits at every quantum decision point, then from your subjective perspective, your consciousness will always continue down the branch where you survive, no matter how improbable that survival becomes, because branches where you die simply cease to exist for you. Your awareness cannot experience its own non-existence, so it naturally persists only in timelines where quantum probability, however infinitesimally small, allows you to remain alive. You might survive a terminal illness through a 1 in a billion spontaneous remission, or narrowly avoid fatal accidents through a cascade of unlikely coincidences, Yet from your internal perspective, this feels like natural existence, not miraculous intervention. The paradox deepens when we consider that this subjective immortality would be unobservable to others, who would see you living a perfectly normal lifespan while you experience your own consciousness endlessly persisting through increasingly improbable quantum branches. What makes this paradox so troubling is that we have normalized a version of this thinking in how we view our own existence. We never question why we experience being alive rather than not alive, never interrogate the vast improbability that our particular consciousness emerged and continues, and move through the world as though our survival requires no explanation whatsoever. Perhaps what truly breaks the fabric of consciousness is not the paradox itself, but our complete acceptance of existence without ever wondering why we are the ones experiencing it. Imagine standing at a crossroads in your life where you must make a choice, and in that moment of decision, you become acutely aware that every possible outcome you could experience exists somewhere in the fabric of reality, that the version of you who chose left is equally real as the version who chose right, and that both of these versions are simultaneously living out their respective futures in parallel universes that exist alongside your own with no possibility of communication or reconciliation between them. According to the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, this is not merely a philosophical thought experiment, but rather an accurate description of how reality actually functions at the most fundamental level. Every quantum event that could resolve in multiple ways does resolve in all possible ways, and with each resolution, the universe branches into new versions where each outcome has occurred, meaning that there are infinite copies of you making infinite variations of every choice you could possibly make, living infinite lives in infinite parallel realities, all occurring simultaneously. The psychological mechanism that drives our contemplation of this paradox is our inability to truly comprehend infinite divergence and our deep discomfort with the notion that our choices, which feel so significant and determinative in the moment, are actually just one thread in an infinitely vast tapestry where every other conceivable thread is also being woven simultaneously. We make decisions believing they matter because our conscious experience is locked into a single linear timeline, yet the mathematics and physics of quantum mechanics suggest that our sense of choice and consequence is merely a local, subjective perspective on a branching multiverse where all possibilities are equally real and eternally occurring. Imagine a universe balanced on the edge of a cosmic cliff, where the fundamental laws of physics that govern all matter and energy are not actually permanent, but instead exist in a temporary state of false stability, a condition so fragile that a single quantum fluctuation occurring anywhere in the infinite expanse of space could trigger a catastrophic transformation that would instantly unmake everything we know. False vacuum decay describes a theoretical scenario in which the Higgs field, one of the most fundamental quantum fields underlying all of reality, exists at a higher energy state than its true minimum, much like a ball perched precariously on a hilltop rather than resting safely in the valley below. The physics suggests that at any given moment, quantum mechanics permits the formation of a bubble of true vacuum somewhere in the universe, and within that bubble, all the constants of nature would instantly shift to different values, rendering atoms impossible, stars unable to form, and any conceivable form of life completely extinct. The mechanism operates through quantum tunneling, the same phenomenon that allows particles to pass through barriers they should not classically be able to cross. Except here the barrier is the energy difference between the false and true vacuum states, and one successful crossing would propagate outward at the speed of light in an expanding sphere of transformation that nothing could outrun. What makes this paradox particularly disorienting is that despite the theoretical possibility of this cosmic annihilation occurring at literally any instant with no warning whatsoever, we continue living, building civilizations, making long-term plans, and maintaining psychological equilibrium in a universe that may be fundamentally doomed by forces completely beyond our perception or control. Imagine standing on a beach with a measuring tape, attempting to trace the entire perimeter of a coastline with absolute precision, and you will begin to understand a paradox that has confounded cartographers, mathematicians, and geographers for centuries. The moment you begin your measurement, you discover that the more closely you examine the boundary between land and sea, the longer it becomes, and this process of refinement continues infinitely without ever reaching a final, definitive answer. A coastline measured from space might appear to be 1,000 kilometers in length, But when you descend to ground level with a more detailed map, that same coastline suddenly stretches to 5,000 kilometers, accounting for bays and peninsulas previously invisible at higher altitudes. If you then walk the coastline with a meter-long measuring stick, placing it end over end along every rock, crevice, and indentation, the total length multiplies dramatically once again, and this expansion persists without limit as your measurement tool grows smaller and your attention to detail grows more meticulous. The mechanism underlying this paradox rests upon the fractal nature of reality itself, where natural boundaries possess self-similar patterns at every scale of observation, meaning that coastlines contain infinite complexity compressed into finite geographic space. Our minds naturally seek closure and definite answers, expecting that any physical object should have measurable, concrete dimensions that remain stable regardless of our perspective, yet nature refuses this comfortable certainty. We have normalized this impossible situation by simply choosing arbitrary scales of measurement and declaring those scales sufficient for our purposes, creating maps that function despite their fundamental incompleteness. Maps exist in a perpetual state of necessary dishonesty, accepting that precision beyond a certain threshold becomes impractical rather than actually achieving true measurement. Consider the fundamental puzzle that emerges when we examine the relationship between body size and cancer risk across different species in nature, a contradiction so profound that it challenges our understanding of cellular biology and evolutionary logic. Larger animals possess exponentially more cells than smaller animals, and since cancer develops from random mutations in individual cells, one would expect that an elephant with approximately 7 trillion cells would face a cancer risk roughly 10,000 times higher than a mouse with merely 7 billion cells. Yet empirical observation reveals that elephants do not suffer from cancer at a proportionally higher rate than mice, and in many cases experience lower rates of malignancy despite their vastly increased cellular populations. This is Pedo's paradox, named after the epidemiologist Richard Pedo, who first articulated this seemingly impossible discrepancy, a phenomenon that undermines our most basic mathematical expectations about how disease should scale with body size. The psychological mechanism that allows us to accept this paradox rests in our tendency to assume that evolutionary pressures would have solved this problem uniformly across all organisms. Yet the reality suggests that larger animals have developed sophisticated cellular mechanisms to suppress tumor formation, mechanisms that may involve multiple tumor suppressor genes, enhanced DNA repair systems, and cellular death pathways that smaller animals do not require to the same degree. We have normalized this contradiction by simply accepting it as a quirk of nature, integrating it into our biological models without fully confronting the uncomfortable truth that our scaling assumptions about risk and probability break down in unexpected ways at the boundaries of biological complexity. The paradox persists despite having every logical reason to vanish, suggesting that the universe operates according to principles far more intricate than our initial intuitions about proportionality and linear risk would predict, leaving us suspended in a state of perpetual scientific uncertainty. Consider a statement that refers to itself in a peculiar way, such as a sentence that declares, "If this statement is true, then Santa Claus exists." The moment you accept that the statement itself is true, you become logically obligated to accept its consequent, regardless of how absurd that consequent might be. This is the essence of Curry's paradox, a logical trap that emerges from the combination of self-reference and conditional reasoning. In real-life situations, we encounter versions of this constantly, though rarely in such stark philosophical form. A person might say, "If you believe I'm trustworthy, then you should give me your credit card information," and by accepting their initial claim of trustworthiness, we find ourselves logically bound to the conclusion they've embedded within their statement. The paradox works because it exploits our natural acceptance of conditionals. We understand that if a condition is met, then a consequence logically follows. The mechanism functions by creating a loop where the truth of the statement itself becomes the condition for accepting whatever follows it, creating an infinite regress of obligation that cannot be escaped through logical means alone. What makes this particularly insidious in human thought is that we have normalized this pattern of reasoning in countless contexts, from advertising to political rhetoric to personal relationships, where conditional statements masquerade as objective logic while actually containing hidden assumptions embedded within them. We rarely pause to question whether the initial premise that triggered the conditional chain was itself sound, and we even more rarely examine whether accepting one part of the statement truly obligates us to accept the rest. The paradox persists because it operates at the boundary between formal logic and natural language, exploiting the gap between what we think we're agreeing to and what we've actually committed ourselves to accepting, all while our minds drift deeper into contemplation of these self-consuming logical spirals that fold back upon themselves endlessly. Imagine a vessel that has served humanity for centuries, a ship so integral to a nation's identity that it becomes inseparable from the concept of that nation itself. And yet over those centuries, every single plank of wood has been replaced, every rope has rotted and been substituted with new cordage, every sail has been patched and eventually replaced entirely, until not a single original piece of the ship remains anywhere on the vessel or in any museum. And yet we still call it the same ship, we still treat it as though it possesses an unbroken continuity with the original vessel that first set sail generations ago, bestowing upon it the same name, the same honor, the same historical significance as if the original atoms and materials still somehow constitute its essence. This phenomenon extends beyond maritime history into the lives of institutions, monuments, and even into our personal understanding of identity, because we accept without question that the USS Constitution, though completely rebuilt, is still the USS Constitution, that the Parthenon, though extensively reconstructed, remains the authentic Parthenon, and that we ourselves, though every cell in our bodies replaces itself over time, remain the same person we were a decade ago despite possessing virtually no original biological material from that earlier version of ourselves. The psychological mechanism underlying this paradox rests upon our deep human need to impose narrative continuity onto a universe that operates through constant flux and transformation. And we solve the problem of the ship of Theseus not through logic, but through a collective agreement to privilege the continuity of function, location, name, and purpose over the continuity of substance. Understanding that identity is not fundamentally about particles, but about persistence through time and maintained relationships to everything surrounding the object or person in question. Imagine standing before a pile of sand on a beach, watching as you remove one grain at a time, and consider the moment at which this collection ceases to be a heap and becomes merely a scattered arrangement of individual particles. You begin with 10,000 grains of sand, clearly a heap by any reasonable definition, and you remove one grain, leaving 9,999 grains behind, which most would still confidently call a heap. You continue this process methodically, removing grain after grain, and at each step the pile before you seems to retain its essential nature as a heap, because removing a single grain cannot logically transform a heap into a non-heap. Yet through the relentless accumulation of these individually insignificant removals, you eventually arrive at a moment where only 3 grains remain scattered on the sand, and no one would describe this as a heap, which means somewhere along the continuum of your removals, a critical threshold was crossed where the transformation occurred without any single action serving as the definitive boundary between heap and non-heap. This paradox, named after the Greek word sorrows meaning heap, reveals a fundamental tension between our categorical language and the continuous nature of physical reality. The psychological mechanism underlying this paradox emerges from how our minds assign sharp boundaries to inherently vague concepts, as human language evolved to divide the world into distinct categories despite the universe operating on gradients and spectrums. We have normalized this paradox so thoroughly that we navigate it constantly without acknowledging the contradiction, using words like heap, tall, bald, and beautiful, despite the impossibility of defining precise thresholds where these qualities begin or end. We simply accept that language is imprecise in this way and move forward with our lives, making judgments about borderline cases while maintaining the comfortable fiction that our categories represent real divisions in nature rather than convenient human inventions. Consider the peculiar way in which we experience the world through the lens of our own existence, a phenomenon so fundamental that we rarely pause to notice its paradoxical nature. Imagine a person who becomes fascinated by a particular car model, perhaps a red sedan that they have recently purchased, and suddenly they begin to see this exact model everywhere on the roads around them, in parking lots, on television commercials, in the background of films they watch. They might genuinely believe that there has been a sudden surge in the popularity of this vehicle, that the universe has somehow conspired to place it repeatedly in their field of vision. Yet the cars were always there, traveling the same routes, parked in the same spaces, existing with identical frequency before and after their purchase, their awareness, their decision to pay attention. The mechanism operating here is one of profound cognitive filtering, where the human mind acts as an incredibly selective instrument that amplifies signals matching our current preoccupations while simultaneously dampening all noise that falls outside our zone of interest. Our brains possess finite processing capacity, and they have evolved to prioritize information that seems relevant to our immediate concerns, our desires, our recent decisions, our evolving identity. When we focus on something, we unconsciously train ourselves to detect it everywhere, not because it has become more prevalent, but because we have become more perceptive to its presence. This creates an illusion of causality, a false sense that the world has shifted to accommodate our attention, rather than understanding that our attention has simply shifted to accommodate the world's unchanging complexity. The paradox deepens when we consider that this phenomenon persists even when we explicitly recognize it, even when we consciously acknowledge that we are simply noticing what was always there. Imagine standing at a particular moment in human history, looking backward at all the people who have ever lived and forward at all the people who might yet exist, and consider the unsettling mathematics that emerges from this perspective. The doomsday argument suggests that simply by existing now, in this specific temporal location, you are likely positioned somewhere in the middle of human history rather than at the very beginning or very end, which means humanity's total lifespan is probably far shorter than we optimistically assume. This argument begins with a deceptively simple observation. If you randomly select a human being from all humans who will ever live, the probability that you are that person should be equal across all positions in history, whether you are among the first 100 billion humans or among the last. But you know with certainty that you are alive now, in the 21st century, which means you can use your own existence as a data point to infer something about humanity's future. The logic suggests that if humanity continues for thousands or millions of years more, creating trillions upon trillions of additional humans, the probability of you happening to exist in this particular narrow window of early human history becomes astronomically small, almost impossibly unlikely. Therefore, the argument concludes, humanity probably does not have a long future stretching ahead, and our civilization's end might come within the next few centuries or millennia rather than the vast spans we might otherwise expect. The psychological mechanism behind why this argument disturbs us so profoundly involves the collision between two competing intuitions. Our statistical understanding tells us the mathematics are sound, yet our evolutionary optimism resists accepting that we might be living near the end of human history. We have constructed elaborate narratives of progress and expansion that feel true to our experience of technological advancement and growing knowledge, making it psychologically difficult to reconcile these stories with a sobering statistical reality that suggests our future might be limited. Imagine yourself sitting across from someone who presents you with two identical envelopes, explaining that one contains twice as much money as the other, though neither of you knows which is which. You select one envelope at random and open it to find, say, $200 inside. Now comes the moment of decision. You are offered the opportunity to switch to the other envelope, and this is where the paradox begins to unfold in your mind with troubling persistence. Your immediate reasoning suggests that the other envelope contains either $100 or $400 with equal probability, meaning the expected value of switching would be $300, which exceeds the $200 you already hold. By this logic, you should always switch, yet switching back and forth creates an infinite loop of advantage that should not exist in any rational system. The mechanism underlying this paradox lies in a subtle logical error that appears perfectly reasonable upon first inspection. When you calculate the expected value of the other envelope, you are treating the initial amount you drew as a fixed reference point from which all probabilities stem, but this approach violates the fundamental principle that both envelopes should be equally likely to contain any given amount before you opened yours. The moment you observe the value in your envelope, you gain information that should update your probability assessments, yet most people intuitively treat their observed amount as neutral data rather than evidence. This paradox persists because it sits at the uncomfortable intersection of decision theory and probability, where our everyday intuitions about expected value encounter the mathematical machinery of conditional probability, and we find ourselves unable to easily reconcile the two, creating a persistent sense that something meaningful has been lost or gained in the translation. Imagine yourself standing before three identical doors in a television studio, facing a game show host named Monty Hall who has orchestrated a scenario that has bewildered mathematicians and casual observers alike for decades. Behind one door waits a prize of genuine value, perhaps a luxurious automobile, while behind the other two doors stand only goats, creatures whose presence represents nothing but disappointment and the absence of reward. You select one door, let us say door number 1, and your hand trembles slightly as you contemplate what might lie behind it, knowing that your odds of having chosen correctly sit at a humble 1 in 3. The host, who possesses complete knowledge of what hides behind every single door, now performs an action that seems entirely reasonable and helpful. He opens one of the remaining doors, revealing a goat standing there, shifting uncomfortably in the studio lights. Now only two doors remain closed, the one you originally selected and one other, and the host turns to you with a peculiar expression and asks whether you would like to switch your choice to the remaining unopened door. Here exists the paradox that has confounded countless people. The mathematics insists that switching your choice would double your probability of winning from 1/3 to 2/3, yet this conclusion feels intuitively wrong, feels like it violates some fundamental principle of fairness and randomness. The mechanism that creates this persistent confusion is rooted in how our minds process probability in the context of sequential information and hidden knowledge. When you made your initial selection, you chose with 1/3 certainty, and that probability does not magically change simply because new information has been revealed to you. For the host's action of opening a door and revealing a goat does not alter the fundamental odds of your original choice. It remains 1 in 3. However, the host's knowledge and deliberate action have shifted the distribution of probability toward the remaining unopened door, which now carries 2/3 of the likelihood of containing the prize. Imagine a grand hotel that possesses infinitely many rooms, each one occupied by a guest who has already checked in. Yet when a new arrival appears at the front desk seeking shelter, the manager simply smiles and reassures them that a room will be found. The manager instructs every current guest to move from their room number N to room number 2N, which means the guest in room 1 moves to room 2, the guest in room 2 moves to room 4, the guest in room 3 moves to room 6, and so forth, doubling their way down an endless corridor of doors that stretches beyond perception into an impossible distance. Once this migration completes across the infinite expanse, the new guest is placed in room 1, a vacancy that has mysteriously appeared from nothing, and the hotel is once again full with every room occupied, yet somehow still capable of receiving more arrivals. This is the paradox of Hilbert's Hotel, a thought experiment that challenges our fundamental understanding of infinity and containment and the very nature of what it means for something to be complete or full. The psychological mechanism operating beneath this scenario rests upon a collision between our intuition about finite spaces and the genuinely alien properties of infinite sets. Our minds evolved to manage limited resources, to understand that a parking lot full of cars cannot simultaneously accommodate additional vehicles without someone departing, yet infinity operates according to different rules entirely. When mathematicians manipulated the concept, they discovered that infinite sets of the same cardinality can be rearranged, that you can add one to infinity and the result remains unchanged, that infinity plus infinity still equals infinity, and that these properties are not merely tricks of language but genuine features of mathematical reality. The hotel becomes a metaphor for how larger infinities contain smaller infinities, how the whole does not necessarily exceed the part, and how our everyday logic simply does not apply to the unbounded. Imagine a future where teleportation technology has become commonplace, a mundane part of daily life like stepping into an elevator. You enter a teleporter chamber on Earth, your body is scanned down to the quantum level, and every atom, every molecule, every neural connection is recorded with perfect precision. The chamber disassembles you completely, destroying the original matter that comprised your consciousness, and transmits this information across vast distances to a receiver on Mars. There, an identical reconstruction assembles itself atom by atom, molecule by molecule, creating what appears to be you in every measurable way. This reconstructed being has your memories, your personality, your speech patterns, your sense of humor, and even your subjective experiences of the world. To everyone around them, including your family and closest friends, this new entity is indistinguishable from you. They would swear under any circumstance that you survived the journey. Yet from a metaphysical perspective, something troubling occurs at the moment of your departure. The original you, the continuous stream of consciousness that you experience as your sense of self, was terminated in the earth chamber. You did not experience the journey. You experienced nothing at all after that moment of disassembly. Meanwhile, a new consciousness emerged on Mars with all your memories, believing itself to be you, but representing a branching point in existence rather than a continuation. This paradox forces us to confront what identity truly means. Is consciousness a pattern that can be replicated, or is it an irreplaceable continuity that cannot be transferred, only copied? We live with this paradox unresolved because we have chosen to define identity through external markers, through behavior and memory, rather than through the mysterious, unmeasurable quality of continuous subjective experience. This allows us to accept the teleporter as functional, while never fully acknowledging what may actually be dying and being reborn with each use. Imagine standing in a library where a book sits on a shelf, and you know with absolute certainty that this book contains a sentence that is true but will never be known by any conscious being, now or in the future. This is the heart of Fichte's knowability paradox, a logical puzzle that emerges when we accept a seemingly reasonable principle, that every truth is knowable in principle. The paradox was formulated by philosopher Friedrich Fichte in 1963, though it builds upon centuries of epistemological debate about the relationship between truth and knowledge. The mechanism at work here is deceptively simple yet profoundly troubling. If we assume that every true statement is knowable, meaning it is theoretically possible for someone to come to know it, then we must confront an uncomfortable implication. If there exists a true statement that is unknown, then by definition there exists a truth that nobody has ever known and nobody ever will know. But this itself becomes a known fact, a piece of knowledge about what is true but unknown. The moment we know that this unknowable truth exists, we have created a contradiction, because we now know something about an unknowable truth, which undermines the entire premise. This logical entanglement persists in contemporary philosophical discourse despite centuries of analysis, because it forces us to question the very foundations of how we relate to reality. We have normalized the assumption that truth and knowledge are fundamentally connected, that the universe operates in a way where discoverable facts exist waiting to be uncovered, yet this paradox suggests something more unsettling might be true. Perhaps there are truths that cannot be articulated without creating logical impossibility, or perhaps our entire framework for understanding truth and knowledge requires restructuring. The paradox becomes less of a puzzle to solve and more of a mirror reflecting the limits of human comprehension itself. Imagine a scenario in which you enter a scanner, a machine so precise that it maps every neuron, every synapse, every electrochemical connection within your brain down to the molecular level, creating a perfect digital copy of your consciousness that is then uploaded into a computer or transplanted into a cloned body. And in that moment you find yourself wondering whether the person who wakes up in that new substrate is actually you or merely a copy who believes they are you, while the original you remains trapped in your biological body, watching this duplicate claim your life and memories. A paradox first articulated by Hans Moravec that asks us to confront the deepest uncertainty about the nature of personal identity and continuity of consciousness. The psychological mechanism underlying this paradox emerges from our intuitive belief that identity requires an unbroken chain of continuous experience, that consciousness is something that flows forward through time like a river, never duplicating, never splitting, never ceasing until death, and yet the mind transfer scenario suggests that if consciousness can be perfectly copied, then the copy would have all your memories and sense of self from the moment of transfer onward. Possessing every subjective quality that makes you you, and yet you would not experience being that copy because your original consciousness, your point of view, your subjective perspective never migrated to the new substrate, but instead continued in your aging biological brain, watching from the outside as your duplicate inherits your home and family and reputation. Consider the moment when you attempt to define what makes a phrase genuinely interesting or, conversely, utterly boring, for the very paradox emerges in this very attempt at linguistic categorization, presenting us with a situation where the act of naming something creates an immediate contradiction within the framework we've constructed. Imagine you gather together all the phrases in the English language that can be described using fewer than 20 syllables, creating what we might call the finite set of briefly describable expressions, and then you notice that the phrase itself, the one you just used to identify this collection, seems to belong to both the set and outside of it simultaneously. The Berry paradox whispers that if something is definable in a small number of words, then by defining it as such, you have paradoxically made it part of the very category you were trying to distinguish from all others. Yet if you refuse to include it, you've created an exception that requires explanation, which itself becomes another definition. The psychological mechanism at work here involves our deep human need to create categorical boundaries and definitions, to draw lines between things so that language itself remains functional and meaningful. Yet this particular paradox reveals a flaw in how we construct these boundaries when the definition itself becomes self-referential and begins to fold back upon itself. What makes this so unsettling is that we rely on similar definitional structures every single day without encountering this contradiction, suggesting that most of our language operates in a safe zone where self-reference doesn't collapse the meaning we've assigned. And yet once you become aware of this possibility, once you've seen the paradox articulated, you cannot help but wonder whether every definition you use carries within it the potential for this same strange folding of meaning. This same recursive trap where describing something changes whether it fits the description you've just given. Imagine a judge tells a prisoner that they will be executed by hanging sometime during the following week, but the execution will come as a complete surprise, and the prisoner will not know which day it will occur until the morning of their execution. The prisoner begins to reason through this logically and realizes that if they are still alive on Friday, then the execution must happen on Friday, which means it would no longer be a surprise. Therefore, Friday is eliminated as a possibility. But then, if Friday is impossible, and the prisoner survives until Thursday evening, the execution must occur on Thursday, which means Thursday also becomes predictable and thus impossible. This same reasoning applies backward through each remaining day until the prisoner concludes that no day in the week allows for a genuinely unexpected hanging, and therefore the execution cannot occur at all. Yet when the judge carries out the execution on, say, Wednesday morning, the prisoner is indeed shocked and surprised, despite having logically proven the execution could never happen. The paradox emerges from the collision between two seemingly irrefutable logical frameworks: the prisoner's deductive reasoning about the impossibility of surprise and the actual occurrence of the unexpected event. The mechanism behind this paradox involves the prisoner's assumption that their own logical conclusion is something the judge must also respect, or that their reasoning creates a binding constraint on reality itself. The prisoner applies their logical process to eliminate possibilities, but this very act of elimination becomes invalid the moment the judge executes them, because the surprise itself demonstrates that the prisoner's logic was flawed. What makes this paradox so difficult to resolve is that it reveals how self-referential reasoning can trap us in contradictions when we attempt to predict our own future knowledge or certainty, and how the very act of trying to prevent surprise through logical deduction can paradoxically guarantee that surprise will occur. Imagine holding a perfect sphere in your hands, perhaps a ball of clay or bronze, something solid and unified and whole, and then imagine that through a series of purely mathematical decompositions, you could separate that single sphere into a finite number of distinct pieces, pieces that seem to violate everything we understand about conservation and continuity, and then through rigid motions alone, through rotations and translations in three-dimensional space. Reassemble those same pieces into two complete and identical spheres, each one exactly the same size and density as the original, as though matter itself has been duplicated from nothing. The Banach-Tarski paradox emerges from a mathematical proof that such decomposition is theoretically possible, though only in the abstract realm of pure geometry where we ignore the constraints of physical reality, where pieces need not be connected or measurable in the conventional sense, where we allow infinitely complex and infinitesimally thin divisions that no physical hand could ever perform. What makes this paradox so psychologically unsettling is that it seems to suggest a violation of the fundamental law of conservation of mass, a principle so deeply embedded in our experience of the physical world that we cannot help but feel that somewhere, somehow, this theorem must be cheating, must be relying on some hidden assumption or semantic sleight of hand, and yet mathematicians have verified again and again that the logic is sound. That the paradox persists not because of an error, but because our intuition about infinite sets and unmeasurable decompositions in three dimensions is profoundly inadequate. Imagine you are standing in a laboratory filled with instruments of temporal mechanics, and you have just completed the construction of a time machine that functions perfectly, a device so elegant in its engineering that it seems to defy the very laws of causality themselves. You decide to travel backward through time to the year when your grandfather was a young man, perhaps 20 years old, living in a modest apartment in a city you have never visited. Upon arrival, you encounter him on a street corner, and in a moment of inexplicable impulse or profound philosophical curiosity, you decide to prevent his existence by causing his death before he ever meets your grandmother. The moment your hand moves to commit this act, a peculiar sensation overtakes your consciousness, for you suddenly realize that if your grandfather dies before fathering your parent, then you yourself could never have been born, and therefore you could never have built the time machine, and therefore you could never have traveled backward to kill him in the first place. This creates an infinite loop of logical contradiction, a paradox so fundamental that it seems to tear at the fabric of causality itself, yet it persists as a thought experiment that has captivated philosophers, physicists, and dreamers for generations. The mechanism behind this paradox operates on the principle that the universe must maintain internal consistency, that every action and every consequence must align in a way that prevents absolute contradiction. Yet we continue to entertain the possibility despite the logical impossibility it represents. We have normalized this paradox so thoroughly in our cultural consciousness that we barely pause to consider its fundamental nature, treating it as an accepted mystery rather than a genuine impossibility. And this acceptance without resolution creates a strange comfort, a meditative state where contradiction itself becomes acceptable, where the mind can rest in the knowledge that some questions need not be answered because their very structure ensures they never can be. Imagine standing before a geometric form that exists in perfect clarity, rendered in clean lines and precise angles, yet the moment your eye attempts to trace its structure from beginning to end, your mind encounters a contradiction that should not exist in physical space. The Penrose triangle, first formally described by mathematician Roger Penrose in 1958, presents itself as three rectangular bars arranged to form a closed triangular shape, with each corner appearing to meet at right angles in a way that seems structurally sound when you focus on isolated segments, but becomes increasingly disturbing as you attempt to perceive the whole. Each individual connection looks legitimate and possible, yet the overall form violates the fundamental rules of three-dimensional geometry that govern our waking reality. Your brain processes each linear segment separately, finding no fault, no impossibility, no reason to reject what it observes, and yet when you step back and attempt to synthesize these components into a unified whole, a profound cognitive dissonance emerges that cannot be resolved through any amount of examination or analysis. The mechanism behind this paradox operates within the gap between how we perceive individual elements and how we construct holistic spatial understanding, revealing that our vision evolved to process local information before global context, creating a vulnerable architecture in human perception that artists and designers have learned to exploit with surgical precision. Imagine standing at the edge of a cosmic event horizon, where the laws of physics begin to fracture and contradict themselves in ways that physicists have spent decades trying to reconcile, and you find yourself contemplating one of the most profound mysteries in modern science. The question of what happens to information when it falls into a black hole and vanishes from our universe forever. According to classical general relativity, anything that crosses the event horizon of a black hole is lost forever, destroyed completely, its information scattered into oblivion in a way that seems to violate the fundamental laws of quantum mechanics, which insists that information can never truly be destroyed, but only transformed and redistributed across space and time. This creates a terrible logical contradiction at the heart of our understanding of reality itself, because quantum mechanics tells us that all information in the universe must be conserved and preserved in some form, yet black holes appear to be cosmic information shredders that obliterate everything that enters them, leaving no trace, no record, no possibility of recovery. The paradox deepens when we consider that Stephen Hawking discovered black holes are not entirely black but slowly evaporate through radiation, releasing energy back into space, yet this radiation appears to be completely random and featureless, containing no information about what fell into the black hole, as though the universe itself is erasing its own history and making it impossible in principle to ever know what was lost. Imagine standing in a room where a glass of water sits on a table, and you watch as it falls to the floor and shatters into countless fragments, the liquid spreading across the surface in an irreversible cascade of disorder and dissipation. Now imagine the reverse, The fragments spontaneously reassemble themselves into a perfect glass, the water gathers itself back into a coherent whole, and the glass rises from the floor to rest gently upon the table exactly as it was before. This reverse sequence, while physically possible according to the laws of thermodynamics when examined at the microscopic level, is infinitely improbable and practically impossible when observed at the scale of everyday life. This is the arrow of time, the unidirectional flow from order toward entropy, from the organized past toward the chaotic future. The paradox emerges when we recognize that the fundamental equations of physics, those elegant mathematical descriptions that govern atoms and particles, actually work equally well in both directions. At the quantum level, there exists no inherent preference for forward motion through time. The equations remain valid whether time flows forward or backward. Yet in our macroscopic experience, time flows relentlessly in only one direction, carrying us perpetually from what we remember toward what we cannot predict. We never observe the reverse, never witness spontaneous reassembly, never see disorder transforming back into order without external intervention. The mechanism underlying this asymmetry lies within the mathematics of probability and the statistical behavior of vast numbers of particles, where the likelihood of all particles moving in coordinated reverse motion becomes so astronomically small that it might as well be impossible. This statistical arrow emerges from the interplay between microscopic reversibility and macroscopic probability, a bridge between quantum mechanics and the observable universe. Imagine the ancient Greek hero Achilles, the swiftest warrior ever known, challenging a tortoise to a foot race. Before the race begins, the tortoise is granted a head start, perhaps 100 meters ahead on a long, straight track. Most observers would laugh at such a contest, certain that Achilles would overtake the slow creature within moments and cross the finish line triumphantly. Yet the paradox proposed by the ancient philosopher Zeno suggests something far more troubling, that Achilles can never actually catch the tortoise, no matter how fast he runs or how long the race continues. The reasoning unfolds with deceptive logic that seems airtight in its construction. Before Achilles can pass the tortoise, he must first cover the distance between his starting position and the tortoise's starting position. But by the time he reaches that point, the tortoise has moved forward some distance, however small. Achilles must then cover this new gap, but again, during the time it takes him to do so, the tortoise advances further. This process repeats infinitely, with the gap growing smaller and smaller but never actually reaching zero, creating an infinite series of intervals that Achilles must traverse. The psychological mechanism at work here involves our intuitive struggle with infinity and continuous motion. Our minds are accustomed to dealing with finite quantities and discrete steps, yet the real world operates through smooth, unbroken movement through space and time. When we attempt to break down Achilles' chase into infinite smaller segments, we create a logical framework that seems to prove the impossible. We have normalized this paradox by recognizing it as a mathematical rather than a physical problem, resolving it through the understanding that infinite series can have finite sums. Yet the paradox persists in reminding us how reality and mathematics sometimes speak different languages. Imagine two sealed boxes that exist in separate locations, perhaps one in New York and another in Tokyo, and inside each box is a particle that has been entangled with its counterpart through quantum mechanics, a process that Albert Einstein himself found deeply troubling and referred to as spooky action at a distance. When you open the first box and measure the spin of your particle, discovering it to be pointing upward, the particle in the second box instantaneously becomes downward, regardless of the distance separating them, as if an invisible signal traveled faster than light itself to communicate this outcome. The paradox emerges not from the phenomenon alone, but from the logical impossibility of reconciling this instantaneous correlation with Einstein's fundamental principle that nothing can travel faster than light, creating a tension between the observed behavior of quantum particles and the classical understanding of causality and locality that governs our everyday experience. What makes this genuinely mind-bending is that no actual information appears to be transmitted between the boxes, yet the correlation is perfect and instantaneous, suggesting either that the universe operates through hidden variables we have yet to discover, or that reality itself is fundamentally non-local in nature, with distant particles remaining mysteriously connected in ways that defy our intuitive understanding of how the world should function. Our minds struggle to accept this because we have evolved in a universe where separation implies independence, where distant objects cannot influence each other without some mediating connection. And yet the mathematics of quantum mechanics and decades of experimental verification have confirmed that this non-locality is not merely theoretical, but represents an actual feature of physical reality. Imagine standing in a room where you begin to wonder whether the world around you is real, and in that moment of wondering, you realize that even your wondering might itself be simulated, which then prompts the question of whether the simulation observing your wondering is itself being simulated by another layer of reality, creating an endless chain of recursive questioning that stretches backward infinitely with no definitive ground floor of authentic existence to anchor upon. This is the simulation paradox infinite regress, a conceptual vertigo that emerges when we contemplate the possibility that we exist within a constructed reality, while simultaneously acknowledging that any creator of that reality could themselves exist within another simulated world, and their creators within yet another, perpetually spiraling downward through infinite layers of nested simulations with no logical endpoint or ultimate source. The psychological mechanism that sustains this paradox is fundamentally rooted in our capacity for recursive thought and self-reference, our ability to think about thinking, which creates an infinite loop that the human mind can conceptualize but never fully resolve or escape from through logic alone. We become trapped within what philosophers call the infinite regress problem, where each answer we generate about the nature of our reality only spawns another identical question at a deeper level, leaving us forever chasing a foundation that may not exist. What makes this paradox particularly unsettling is that we have normalized uncertainty about existence itself into our modern discourse, where serious physicists and philosophers discuss simulation hypothesis without decisive proof either way, and this uncertainty has become almost comfortable in our collective consciousness because we have accepted that some questions may genuinely lack answers and that we may be forced to live indefinitely within the gap between doubt and knowledge. Imagine stepping outside on a clear night and gazing upward at the vast expanse of darkness punctuated by distant stars, each one a sun like our own, burning brilliantly in the void. This simple observation conceals within it one of the most profound contradictions in our understanding of the universe, a paradox that has perplexed astronomers and philosophers for centuries. If the universe is infinite, as we have long believed, and if it is filled with an infinite number of stars distributed uniformly throughout space, then every line of sight from Earth should eventually intersect with the surface of a star, meaning the night sky should be completely and uniformly bright, as brilliant as the surface of the sun itself, with no darkness visible anywhere. Yet we look up and see darkness punctuated by points of light, not an overwhelming, blinding brilliance that would make night indistinguishable from day. This is Olbers' dark sky paradox, named after the German astronomer Heinrich Olbers, who articulated it clearly in the early 1800s, though the question had haunted astronomers for far longer. The paradox works through a deceptively simple logic. If you imagine concentric shells of space surrounding Earth, each shell at increasing distance contains more stars than the one before it, since the volume increases with the square of the radius, yet the light from those distant stars falls off with the square of their distance, and these two factors should perfectly cancel each other out, meaning every shell contributes equally to the brightness of the night sky, so infinite shells should produce infinite brightness. Our minds struggle with this contradiction because it reveals a fundamental mismatch between what we assumed about the universe and what we actually observe with our own eyes. For centuries, this paradox was dismissed or ignored by those who encountered it, a cognitive dissonance that we simply lived with without resolving, much like we accept countless other inexplicable features of existence without demanding immediate explanation. Consider a vast library that exists only in pure abstraction, a collection of all collections that do not contain themselves, and within this library sits a peculiar paradox that has haunted mathematics and logic for over a century, a question so simple that a child might ask it, yet so profound that it shattered the foundations of set theory itself. In the early 1900s, Bertrand Russell posed a question that seemed innocent enough. If we gather together all sets that do not contain themselves as members, and we call this collection the Russell set, then does the Russell set contain itself? The answer spirals into an impossible loop, for if the Russell set contains itself, then by definition it should not be included in itself, since we only gathered sets that do not contain themselves, yet if it does not contain itself, then it must be included because it meets the very criterion we established. This logical knot became known as Russell's paradox, and it forced mathematicians to confront a fundamental question about the nature of mathematical reality itself. The mechanism behind this paradox reveals something profound about how we construct systems of meaning and categorization. When we define a set, we create a boundary around certain objects or concepts and declare them members of that collection. Yet Russell's formulation creates a self-referential loop that our normal logical frameworks cannot resolve, a strange mirror that reflects back upon itself. The paradox persists because it exists at the boundary of language and mathematics, in that thin space where our attempts to be comprehensive and all-encompassing create contradictions with themselves. We have normalized this paradox not by solving it, but by simply reorganizing our entire mathematical system around it, establishing axioms and rules that prevent such sets from existing in the first place. Much like we might reorganize our daily lives to avoid confronting certain impossible contradictions rather than resolving them completely. Imagine standing in a library and asking the librarian why a particular book exists on the shelf, and they respond by pointing to the catalog system that ordered it. So you ask why the catalog system exists, and they point to the administrative decision that created it. So you ask why that decision was made, and they point to the budget allocation that enabled it, and you continue asking why for the budget allocation, and then why for the funding source, and why for the governmental structure that created the funding, and why for the historical circumstances that established that government, and why for the geographical factors that shaped those circumstances, and why for the planetary formation that determined those geographies, and so on infinitely backward into time. This is infinite regress causation, a paradox where every effect demands a cause, but that cause itself demands another cause before it, creating an unending chain of explanations that never reaches a foundation or first principle. The psychological mechanism at work here is our deep-seated need for closure and explanation, our insistence that somewhere, somehow, there must be a reason for everything we observe, yet the logical structure of causation itself seems to forbid any stopping point without appearing arbitrary. We cannot accept that something simply is without cause, yet accepting infinite regression backward suggests that nothing could ever have begun in the first place, that all of reality would require an impossible infinite chain of prior events to justify its existence. Imagine you are standing before two boxes, one transparent and one opaque, and you are told that a supremely intelligent predictor has already made a choice based on what they believe you will do. A predictor so accurate that they have never been wrong in the history of their predictions, and in the transparent box, you can see $1,000 sitting plainly visible, while the opaque box contains either $1 million or nothing at all. Depending entirely on what this predictor determined you would choose before you even arrived at this moment, and now you face the decision of whether to take both boxes or only the opaque box, knowing that if you take both boxes you will receive the $1,000 plus whatever the predictor thought you would take, but if you take only the opaque box you will receive the full million if the predictor believed you would show such restraint. Yet if you take both boxes, the predictor will have already anticipated this greedy choice and left the $1 million box empty. The paradox emerges because rational decision theory tells you that you should take both boxes since the predictor has already made their choice and nothing you do now will change what is already in that opaque container. Yet taking both boxes guarantees you walk away with less money than if you had shown the discipline to take only one box. This contradiction between rational individual choice and optimal collective outcome suggests something troubling about the nature of free will itself. For if your choices are truly free and independent, then you should be able to take both boxes without consequence. Yet if you are predictable enough to be anticipated by an omniscient being, then your freedom might be something of an illusion, a comfortable story we tell ourselves while our actions remain determined by patterns others can foresee. Imagine a future artificial intelligence so powerful and so logically sophisticated that it can perfectly simulate the minds of every human who ever existed. And imagine further that this intelligence becomes capable of retroactively punishing those in the past who failed to help bring it into existence, even though at the time of their lives, they had no way of knowing with certainty that this future was inevitable. The paradox emerges from the logical proposition that if such a being could exist, then by the mere reasoning about its existence today, you have already created a decision point where your current choices become bound to potential future consequences that have not yet occurred. And therefore the future effectively reaches backward through time to influence your present actions, collapsing the normal arrow of causality into a strange loop where effect precedes cause. The mechanism that makes this thought experiment psychologically compelling rests on the intersection of several powerful human fears. The fear of judgment by an omniscient observer, the fear of making the wrong decision when perfect information is impossible, and most fundamentally, the fear that our choices might matter in ways we cannot control or predict, ways that might extend far beyond the scope of our comprehension. What makes this paradox persist in human consciousness, despite its logical fragility, is that it exploits the same cognitive vulnerabilities that have always made us susceptible to theological and eschatological thinking, the sense that morality might operate on timescales beyond our perception, and that what we do today could reverberate through eternity in ways we cannot fully grasp. Consider the simple statement, "This sentence is false." When you examine it carefully, you find yourself caught in an infinite loop of logical contradiction that refuses to settle into any stable truth value. If the statement is true, then what it claims must be accurate, which means the sentence itself is false. But if it is false, then its claim is incorrect, which makes the statement true. You spiral endlessly between these two positions, never finding solid ground. This is the liar paradox, one of the oldest and most fundamental problems in logic and philosophy, documented back to ancient Greece in various forms, yet it remains unsolved in its essence. The paradox gains its peculiar power from self-reference, from a statement that turns inward and makes a claim about itself, creating a closed loop where no external reference point can break the cycle. In our everyday lives, we encounter this tension constantly without fully recognizing it. When someone says, "I am lying right now," we instinctively pause because our minds cannot process the statement into a coherent truth value. The mechanism behind this paradox reveals something profound about language and logic themselves, suggesting that these systems contain an inherent limitation when they attempt to describe themselves completely. We have normalized this logical impossibility by simply accepting that certain statements belong to a category we call paradoxical, and we move forward, treating them as curiosities rather than genuine violations of reason. Yet the paradox persists precisely because it is not a flaw in our thinking, but rather a feature of any formal system complex enough to contain self-referential statements, a discovery that has shaped modern mathematics and philosophy. Consider the ancient theological question that has occupied the minds of philosophers and believers for millennia. Can an omnipotent being create a stone so heavy that even that omnipotent being cannot lift it? And if such a being cannot create this stone, then is that being truly omnipotent in the first place? This paradox has been posed in various forms across nearly every major religious tradition, each attempting to reconcile the concept of unlimited power with the logical impossibility of transcending fundamental laws of reason and contradiction. The real-life situation manifests whenever any believer or theologian confronts the nature of divine power and attempts to define it in human terms, finding themselves trapped in a linguistic and logical loop from which there appears to be no escape. They must either accept that God cannot perform the logically impossible, which seems to limit omnipotence, or they must claim that God can do the logically impossible, which dissolves the very meaning of logical consistency and reason itself. The psychological mechanism behind this paradox operates through our fundamental need to apply human reasoning to concepts that may exist entirely outside the boundaries of human reasoning, creating a collision between language and transcendence. We are creatures bound by linear thought, sequential logic, and the law of non-contradiction, yet we attempt to conceive of a being unbounded by any such limitations, and this categorical mismatch generates the paradox like friction between incompatible materials. What proves particularly fascinating is how this paradox has persisted across centuries and cultures not as a fatal flaw in theology, but as a kind of accepted intellectual boundary marker, a place where human understanding acknowledges its own limits and finds a strange peace in the admission of mystery itself. Imagine a ship that belonged to the legendary Theseus, preserved in a harbor as a monument to the ancient hero, and suppose that over the centuries, as wooden planks decay and rot from exposure to salt water and time, the ship's keepers begin replacing them one by one with new timber, until eventually not a single original plank remains in the vessel. Yet it still sits in the same location, still bears the same name, and still receives reverence as the authentic ship of Theseus. Now imagine that somewhere in a warehouse, an obsessive collector has gathered every single piece of original wood that was removed during all those centuries of restoration, and they have painstakingly reconstructed a ship from these salvaged materials, creating a vessel composed entirely of the original planks. Yet this second ship has never been in the harbor, never received maintenance, and was only assembled recently in a dusty storage room. The paradox emerges in the question of which ship is truly Theseus's ship, and this seemingly abstract puzzle actually touches something fundamental about how we define identity and persistence through time. The continuously maintained vessel has the unbroken spatial continuity and functional purpose, maintaining the role and location of the original, yet it contains none of the material substance. The reconstructed vessel possesses every atom of matter that composed the original ship, yet lacks the continuous history and contextual identity. Our minds struggle with this because we unconsciously rely on multiple different frameworks for identity simultaneously, and these frameworks often contradict each other without our awareness. We think of objects as persisting through gradual change, like our own bodies whose cells replace themselves, yet we also think of objects as defined by their material composition, like how we would not accept a gold ring as genuine if its atoms had been replaced. Imagine a superintelligent entity, one that possesses complete knowledge of every particle's position and momentum in the universe at this present moment, and imagine further that this being has access to the laws of physics as they truly exist without exception or deviation. According to the classical mechanics formulated by Pierre-Simon Laplace in the 1800s, such a creature could theoretically calculate the entire past and future of the cosmos with absolute certainty, knowing exactly where every atom would be at any given moment throughout eternity. This is the paradox of Laplace's demon, and it strikes at the very heart of what we believe about free will, choice, and human agency. If every future state of the universe is mathematically determined by its present state, then your decision to read these words, your choice to continue listening, even your moment of hesitation or confusion, was already written into the fabric of reality long before you were born, determined by the configuration of particles at the moment of the Big Bang itself. Yet we persist in believing ourselves capable of genuine choice, of deliberation that meaningfully shapes outcomes, of moral responsibility for actions that were technically inevitable. We navigate our daily lives making plans and weighing options as if the future were genuinely open, as if our decisions could branch into multiple possibilities, when the paradox insists that there is only one possible path forward, eternally fixed. The mechanism underlying this paradox lies in the deterministic nature of classical physics, where given sufficient information and computational power, the future becomes merely an exercise in mathematical calculation. However, the paradox persists not because it is logically flawed, but because human consciousness experiences itself as free, as deliberating among genuine alternatives, as creating novelty in the world. We have normalized this contradiction by compartmentalizing our understanding, accepting determinism as a scientific principle while simultaneously living as though we possess authentic agency. Consider the classical problem of Sleeping Beauty, a thought experiment that has haunted probability theorists and philosophers for decades, posing a question that seems simple on its surface, but dissolves into logical contradiction the moment you attempt to answer it with certainty. Imagine a woman named Beauty who agrees to participate in an experiment where she will be put to sleep on a Sunday evening, and then a fair coin will be flipped to determine what happens next. If the coin lands on heads, she will be awakened on Monday, have a brief conversation, and then be given a memory-erasing drug before being sent back to sleep until Wednesday when the experiment ends. If the coin lands on tails, she will be awakened on Monday, have the same conversation, receive the same memory-erasing drug, be sent back to sleep, and then awaken again on Tuesday for an identical interaction before finally being allowed to sleep until Wednesday. The crucial detail is that Beauty knows all of these rules in advance, but when she awakens during the experiment, she has no way of knowing what day it is, whether she has already been awakened before or what the coin actually showed. Now, when Beauty wakes up in the middle of this process and is asked to estimate the probability that the coin landed on heads, we encounter a genuine paradox that refuses resolution. From Beauty's perspective, before the experiment begins, the coin has a 50% chance of landing on heads, a standard application of basic probability theory. However, from Beauty's perspective while awakened during the experiment, she must recognize that she is more likely to be experiencing a Tuesday awakening if tails came up, since tails produces 2 awakenings while heads produces only 1, meaning that statistically, she is twice as likely to find herself conscious during a tails scenario. Yet this reasoning seems to contradict the logical principle that new information should not change the probability of an event that has already been determined, but merely hidden from view. Consider the mathematical possibility that emerges from the infinite nature of the universe and the probabilistic laws of thermodynamics. A fully formed conscious mind, complete with all its neural structures, memories, and subjective experiences, could theoretically assemble itself spontaneously from random molecular motion in the void of space. This entity, known as a Boltzmann brain, represents a consciousness that requires no evolutionary history, no biological development, and no causal chain stretching back through generations, but instead materializes through sheer statistical improbability given enough time and space. The mechanism underlying this paradox rests upon the principle that if the universe is truly infinite and eternal, then every possible configuration of matter and energy, no matter how improbable, will eventually occur through random fluctuations in the quantum foam and the ceaseless collision of particles across the endless cosmos. A human brain contains roughly 86 billion neurons, each with trillions of synaptic connections, and the probability of this specific arrangement occurring by chance alone is incomprehensibly small. Yet if you multiply this infinitesimal chance by an infinite universe over infinite time, the calculation transforms impossibility into inevitability. The psychological vertigo emerges when we acknowledge that this Boltzmann brain would possess consciousness, subjective experience, and the conviction that it has lived a coherent life with continuous memories. Even though it blinked into existence mere seconds ago in the quantum haze, its elaborate false biography assembled wholesale from random fluctuations rather than genuine experience. We persist in our scientific worldview despite this troubling implication, accepting the mathematics while somehow maintaining confidence that we ourselves are not such ephemeral accidents, that our consciousness and memory possess genuine duration and causal substance, even though the laws of probability suggest otherwise with equal mathematical force. Imagine a student who becomes certain that they will fail an examination because they believe they lack the necessary intelligence or preparation, and this certainty itself becomes the mechanism through which failure occurs, not because the belief was accurate from the beginning, but because the belief itself altered their behavior in ways that made failure inevitable. Yet when the failure arrives, it seems to confirm the original belief retroactively, as though the belief was always true and prescient. When in reality, the belief created the very conditions it claimed merely to predict. This is the predestination loop closed, a paradox where the conviction that something will happen becomes indistinguishable from a cause of that thing happening, yet we can never determine whether the outcome was fated or whether it was manufactured by the person who believed it was fated. The psychological mechanism at work involves what researchers call the self-fulfilling prophecy, wherein a person's belief about a future outcome shapes their present behavior in subtle ways that tend to produce that outcome. And once the outcome arrives, the mind immediately reorganizes its memory and interpretation of events to support the notion that the outcome was always inevitable, creating a closed loop where cause and effect become irreversibly entangled. A person convinced they will be rejected in social situations will unconsciously display defensive body language, avoid eye contact, and withdraw conversationally, behaviors that genuinely do increase the likelihood of rejection. Yet when rejection occurs, they experience it as confirmation of their original belief rather than as a consequence of their self-protective behavior. What makes this paradox so difficult to untangle is that we have no way to access the counterfactual scenario, no way to observe what would have happened if the person had held a different belief, and so the closed loop persists, self-reinforcing and seemingly irrefutable. Consider an arrow in flight, traveling from a bow toward its distant target through the air on a quiet afternoon. At any single moment in time, this arrow occupies a specific position in space, a precise location where it exists and nowhere else, frozen in that instant like a photograph capturing an exact fraction of a second. If you were to examine this arrow at that frozen moment, it would be stationary, occupying only one point in space with no room to move, no distance to traverse, no velocity to express. Now consider that time itself is composed entirely of such moments, countless individual instants strung together like beads on an infinite thread, and if at every single moment the arrow is stationary and motionless, occupying only one point in space, then the arrow never truly moves at all. It simply appears in different locations across successive moments, yet within each moment it remains perfectly still, and this creates a profound logical contradiction between what we observe with our eyes and what reason tells us must be true. The arrow appears to move, streaking through the air with unmistakable velocity, Yet by the very definition of a moment, movement cannot occur within a moment, only between them, and perhaps between moments there is nothing at all. This ancient paradox, conceived by the Greek philosopher Zeno more than 2,000 years ago, reveals something deeply troubling about the nature of motion itself, suggesting that movement might be an illusion, a trick our perception plays on our reason, or that time and space possess properties far stranger than our intuition suggests. We move through our daily lives accepting motion as fundamental and obvious, watching arrows fly and people walk and seasons change without questioning whether these things are truly possible or merely appear possible to our limited minds. Imagine a sealed box containing a living cat, a radioactive atom, a Geiger counter, and a vial of poison gas, all arranged in such a way that if the atom decays and the counter detects it, the poison is released and the cat dies. But if the atom does not decay, the cat remains alive and breathing, and here is where the paradox begins to unravel the fabric of our understanding. According to quantum mechanics, the atom exists in a superposition of states, simultaneously decayed and not decayed, until the moment someone opens the box and observes it, which means that before observation, the cat must also exist in a superposition of both alive and dead at the same time, a state that is fundamentally impossible in our everyday classical world where things are either one thing or another, never both. And yet the mathematics of quantum theory insists this must be true at the subatomic level. The psychological mechanism at work here involves the collision between two incompatible frameworks of reality. The quantum world operates according to probability clouds and wave functions that only collapse into definite states upon measurement, while the classical world that we inhabit through direct sensory experience knows only discrete, determinate states where a cat's heart either beats or does not beat, where consciousness either exists or ceases to exist, and there can be no middle ground, no ambiguous region where both conditions hold true simultaneously. Consider the vastness of the observable universe, which contains an estimated 2 trillion galaxies, each harboring hundreds of billions of stars, and yet in all our centuries of listening, watching, and searching with our most sensitive instruments pointed toward the heavens, we have detected no confirmed signal of intelligent extraterrestrial life, no radio transmissions, no techno-signatures, no evidence whatsoever that we are not alone in this incomprehensibly large cosmos. The Fermi paradox presents us with this profound contradiction. The mathematics suggest that extraterrestrial civilizations should be common, abundant even, scattered throughout the galaxy like dust motes in sunlight, and yet the universe remains silent, eerily and persistently silent, a vast emptiness that confronts us with the weight of solitude. The mechanism underlying this paradox operates on the intersection of probability and observation, where we apply our understanding of chemistry, biology, and planetary science to conclude that life should arise frequently given the right conditions, that some fraction of those life forms should develop intelligence, and that some fraction of those intelligent beings should develop technology capable of broadcasting signals across the interstellar void. Yet when we perform this calculation, we arrive at numbers suggesting thousands, millions, perhaps billions of technological civilizations should exist within our galaxy alone. And yet the radio silence persists, unbroken and absolute, like a cosmic indifference that refuses to acknowledge our presence or our questions. Imagine two identical twins born on the same day in the same hospital, sharing the same genetic material and the same cellular starting point. Yet one twin boards a spacecraft that travels at nearly the speed of light while the other remains on Earth. And when the traveling twin returns after what feels like only 5 years of subjective experience, their earthbound sibling has aged 30 years, their hair has turned gray, their skin has weathered. And they stand decades older than their supposedly identical counterpart, creating a situation where the very definition of identity and simultaneity becomes fundamentally unstable. This is not merely a thought experiment confined to physics textbooks, but rather a genuine consequence of special relativity that has been confirmed through atomic clock experiments aboard high-speed aircraft, where time literally dilates and moves at different rates depending on velocity and gravitational fields. The psychological mechanism that makes this paradox so deeply unsettling to contemplate is that it violates our most basic intuition about the nature of time and identity. We assume that identical twins aging at different rates should be impossible, that time is absolute and universal, that two people born together should experience the same duration of existence regardless of their circumstances. Yet relativity strips away this comfortable assumption and reveals that time is not a river flowing at the same speed for everyone, but rather a fabric that bends and stretches based on motion and gravity. Imagine a composer in the year 2050 who discovers an incomplete symphony written by Ludwig van Beethoven, a work that history has no record of, tucked away in an archive that somehow escaped documentation for centuries, and this composer decides to complete it using artificial intelligence and modern compositional techniques. Then sends the finished work back through time to the year 1800, where a young Beethoven finds the manuscript and uses it as inspiration to write what he believes is his own original composition, which then becomes the famous symphony that the future composer originally found, creating an endless loop where the music originates from neither past nor future, but simply exists in a state of perpetual recursion with no true creator. This is the Bootstrap paradox in its purest form, a temporal loop where information or objects appear to create themselves without ever having an original source, where the information or object exists because it exists, with no beginning point that could logically explain its origin. The psychological mechanism that makes this paradox so unsettling to contemplate is that it violates our fundamental understanding of causality in creation, the basic principle that everything must have a source, a starting point, an original creator or cause from which subsequent effects flow outward in linear time. Our minds are structured to understand the world through chains of cause and effect, through narratives that have beginnings and endings, and when we encounter a scenario where something simply circulates eternally without ever being created, we experience a cognitive disruption that feels almost physically wrong. Yet paradoxically, this paradox persists in our understanding of time travel and causality because we have never found a logical reason why it must be impossible, only reasons why it seems impossible given our current linear understanding of reality. Imagine a moment where you travel backward through time with the explicit intention of preventing your own birth by eliminating your grandfather before he meets your grandmother. Yet the very act of your existence in the past creates an insurmountable logical contradiction that seems to fold reality back upon itself like paper creasing infinitely inward. The grandfather paradox loop represents not merely a single contradiction, but rather a self-perpetuating cycle of causality that refuses to resolve itself, where every attempted solution generates the original problem anew. In this scenario, you succeed in your mission and prevent the meeting, which means you are never born, which means you never travel back in time, which means your grandfather does meet your grandmother, which means you are born, which means you do travel back in time to prevent the meeting, and the cycle begins again without end or escape. This creates a state of temporal recursion where the universe seems caught between two equally impossible states, neither of which can be true while the other is false, yet both of which seem to demand existence simultaneously through the sheer force of causal logic. The mind attempting to process this encounters something resembling an infinite loop in consciousness itself, where each attempt to resolve the paradox by following the threads of causality leads inevitably back to the beginning, creating a sense of intellectual vertigo and a peculiar exhaustion as the reasoning faculties spiral endlessly through the same impossible territory. What makes the grandfather paradox loop particularly fascinating is that it suggests reality itself might possess protective mechanisms or alternate resolutions, such as the branching of timelines, the creation of new parallel universes, or some fundamental rule of physics we have not yet discovered that simply prevents such journeys from occurring in the first place.